They mimic voices. My final report from Acheron Forks National Park. There's a silence you only find in the deep woods. It's not an absence of sound. If you listen, really listen, you can hear it all. The whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant chatter of a creek over stones, the rustle of some small, unseen creature in the undergrowth. It's a living silence, a symphony of solitude. I used to find comfort in it. It's why I became a park ranger. I traded the noise of the city for the quiet language of the wilderness. For years, that language spoke of peace, of cycles, of a raw and honest beauty. But now when I hear that silence, I'm listening for something else. Something that shouldn't be there. Something that doesn't belong. Thank you for joining me again here at the Wilderness Protocol. What I'm about to share with you isn't a legend or a piece of local folklore I picked up at a campfire. This is my own experience. It's a story about why some rules are written in blood and ink, hidden away from public eyes. It's the story of how I learned that not everything that looks human out here is. It started, as many strange things do, with a book. My posting was at Acheron Forks National Park. The name itself should have been a warning, I suppose. Acheron, the river of woe. In retrospect, it was almost comically appropriate. The park is a colossal, sprawling expanse of land, over 2 million acres of jagged, granite peaks that tear at the sky, ancient forests where the trees are so old and dense they block out the sun, and dozens of winding rivers and creeks that carve their way through the landscape. It's the kind of place where you can walk for a week in a straight line and not see another soul, not a single sign of human civilization. Most visitors, the few that came, stuck to the well-marked, sanitized trails near the main entrance in the visitor center. They take their pictures, have their picnic, and leave before sunset. But my world was far removed from that. My station, designated Outpost 3, was nestled deep in the park's northern sector. To get there from the Central Ranger Hub required a solid 2-hour drive along a winding, unforgiving gravel road that was more pothole than path. In the winter, the road was often impassable for weeks at a time. It was isolation perfected. The station itself was a relic from another era, built from sturdy, dark timber back in the 1950s. It was a simple, one-room cabin with a small loft for sleeping and a stone fireplace that was the heart of the structure. The whole place smelled of pine sap, old wood smoke, and the rich, damp earth of the forest floor. For the first 6 months, it was everything I had ever wanted. A hermitage. A sanctuary. My days fell into a comfortable, steady rhythm. I'd spend my mornings maintaining trails, clearing fallen trees after a storm, or checking the batteries on our remote wildlife cameras. The afternoons were for patrols, long, meandering hikes through valleys that probably hadn't seen human footprints in years. I'd occasionally have to guide a lost hiker back to safety, their faces a mixture of relief and embarrassment. But those encounters were rare. The nights were mine, spent with a well-worn paperback, the crackle and pop of the wood stove my only company. I felt a profound sense of purpose out there. I was a guardian, a silent steward to this vast, untamed world. The discovery, the one that changed everything, happened during what should have been the most mundane of tasks. It was a Tuesday in early October. The air was just starting to carry the first real bite of autumn. My assignment for the day was a routine inspection of the park's old, decommissioned infrastructure. High on a ridge overlooking a valley we called Whisperwind Pass stood a dilapidated fire lookout tower. It was a skeleton of a building, a single glass-walled room perched atop a spindly, 60-foot tower of weathered wood and rusting steel. It hadn't been officially used since the late 1970s, made obsolete by satellite monitoring and aerial patrols. It was officially slated for demolition, but the park's perpetual budget cuts and the sheer logistical nightmare of getting heavy equipment up the steep, narrow path meant it was simply left to rot with a sort of lonely dignity. My job was simple: climb up, assess its structural integrity basically, make sure it wasn't about to collapse in the next big storm and, most importantly, confirm that no thrill-seeking teenagers or vagrants had tried to make a home in it. The hike to the tower was strenuous. The trail was overgrown, and I had to push through thorny brambles and navigate around fallen logs. The tower itself looked even more precarious up close than it did from a distance. The wooden stairs that zigzagged up its frame were slick with moss, and many of the boards were soft with rot. The climb up was a nerve-wracking affair, each step producing a loud, painful groan from the wood, protesting my weight. I kept one hand firmly on the rusted metal railing, praying it would hold. When I finally heaved myself up through the trapdoor in the floor, I was met with a rush of stale, trapped air. The single room at the top was a time capsule. It was octagonal, with grimy windows on all sides offering a spectacular, 360-degree view of the park, a view that was now clouded by years of dirt and cobwebs. Sunlight streamed through the filth, illuminating millions of dancing dust motes and thick, golden shafts. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust, decay, and mouse droppings. The only furniture was a simple metal frame cot with a moldy mattress, a single broken wooden chair, and a heavy, government-issued steel desk, its gray paint peeling. I did my inspection. I tested the floorboards, checked the window frames, and made my notes. The structure was surprisingly sound, a testament to its builders. My work was done. I should have just climbed back down and hiked back to my truck. But something made me linger. Curiosity, I suppose. I ran my hand over the dusty surface of the steel desk. I tried the main drawer. It was locked, or rusted shut. I pulled on the second drawer. It slid open with a screech of metal on metal that was jarring in the profound silence. It was empty, save for a dead spider and a scattering of petrified mouse droppings. Then I tried the bottom drawer on the right. It wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, my boots slipping on the dusty floor. It moved a fraction of an inch, then stuck fast. I could see it was warped, the metal bent slightly, likely from decades of changing temperatures and humidity. Now it was a challenge. I took out my multi-tool, wedged the flat end of the screwdriver into the gap, and pried. With a sudden, loud crack, the drawer popped open. The smell of old paper and leather rose from it. It was filled with yellowed, brittle topographical maps, their edges crumbling to dust at my touch. Beneath them was an old logbook, its pages filled with notations about weather patterns and smoke sightings from 1972. And tucked away at the very back, almost hidden in the shadows of the drawer, was something else. It was a book, a manual. But it wasn't a standard-issue government publication. There was no official seal of the Department of the Interior, no government printing office logo. It was bound in dark green, almost black, leather. The cover was completely blank, with no title or markings of any kind. The leather was cracked with age and worn smooth at the corners and spine, a sign that it had been handled and read many, many times. I lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. I opened it. The pages were made of a thick, high-quality, cream-colored paper, a stark contrast to the flimsy material of the logbooks. They were yellowed with age, but still supple. And on the first page, written in an elegant, almost calligraphic handwriting with a fountain pen, were 6 words. A steward's companion. For the eyes of the custodian of Acheron Forks only. Custodian, not ranger. Steward. The choice of words was deliberate, archaic. I felt a small thrill, the thrill of a historian finding a forgotten document. This was a training manual, but unlike any I'd ever seen. It felt personal. Secret. I sat in the one broken chair, dust motes dancing around me in the afternoon light, and began to read. For the first hour, I was engrossed. This was no ordinary field guide. It was part scientific text, part philosophical treatise, part survival guide. The early chapters described flora and fauna unique to the park that weren't in any official biology textbook. Plants with strange psychoactive properties, nocturnal insects that communicated with patterns of light. It spoke of geological anomalies, strange magnetic fields in certain valleys that could throw a compass off by 20 degrees, and water from specific, hidden springs that it warned was never, ever to be consumed, describing its effects not with science, but with chilling metaphor. The writing was formal, almost poetic. It felt less like a government document, and more like a secret society's sacred text, passed down through generations. The chapters had titles like The 5 Voices of the Wind, Reading the River's Mood, and When the Forest Holds Its Breath. I was captivated. I carefully packed the manual in my rucksack, planning to take it back to my station. I told myself it was just a relic, a fascinating piece of park history, likely written by some old, eccentric ranger who had spent too much time alone and had a flair for the dramatic. A way to combat the loneliness and give the park a mythology of its own. That night, back in the warmth and seeming safety of my cabin, with the storm rattling the windows, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and continued to read. I read about protocols for unusually aggressive animal behavior, about markings on trees that weren't from bears or lightning. It was all strange, but I could rationalize it, file it away under ranger folklore. And then, I turned the page and reached chapter 7. The entire mood of the book shifted instantly. The elegant, poetic prose was gone. It was replaced by something stark, clinical, and brutally urgent. The chapter title wasn't written in the flowing calligraphy of the rest of the book. It was printed in bold, blocky, capital letters, as if stamped onto the page with immense force and gravity. Reading that title, alone in my cabin with the wind howling outside, sent a cold, inexplicable shiver down my spine. It was a title that didn't belong in a park ranger's manual. It didn't belong anywhere in the rational world I knew. The chapter was titled, Chapter 7, Recognizing a Human Replica. I remember I actually laughed when I first read that title. It was a nervous, hollow sound that was immediately swallowed by the vast, dark emptiness of the cabin. Human replica? It sounded like something lifted straight from a low-budget, 1950s science fiction movie. The kind of thing you'd watch on a rainy Sunday afternoon. My first, rational thought was that this had to be it. The punchline. This whole manual, this steward's companion, was an elaborate, long-form prank. A piece of ranger lore passed down through the decades specifically to spook the new guy stationed out at the most isolated outpost. I could almost picture a group of old, grizzled rangers laughing about it back at the central hub, wondering if the rookie had gotten to Chapter 7 yet. I took a sip of my whiskey, the warmth spreading through my chest, a small defense against the chill that had touched my spine. I settled deeper into my worn leather armchair, a smirk on my face, and I began to read. The smirk didn't last long. It faded within the first paragraph. This chapter wasn't written like a story. It wasn't folklore. It was a technical document. It was a list of cold, dispassionate, terrifyingly precise set of observations and protocols. It was a field guide for identifying something that was trying and failing to be human. As I read, the howling of the wind outside started to sound less like weather and more like a warning. I'm going to read it to you now, exactly as I read it that night, with the fire crackling and the darkness pressing in against the window panes. This is what the manual said. Introduction. The entity described herein is not a spirit, a demon, a cryptid, or a product of folklore. It is a physical presence. Its origins are unknown. Its motives are indecipherable. It is a mimic, an automaton of flesh and bone, but the copy is flawed. These flaws, these minute imperfections in its performance, are your only advantage. Your survival depends on your ability to recognize them before it recognizes your awareness. Therefore, you must operate under a new primary directive. Treat every unfamiliar individual encountered within the deep park boundaries as a potential replica until proven otherwise through careful, covert observation. Doubt is your shield. Suspicion is your armor. Even the introduction was chilling. It dismissed all the usual supernatural explanations, grounding the threat in a stark, physical reality. It wasn't a ghost story, it was a security briefing. And then, the numbered list began. The laws of recognition. 7.1. The law of symmetry. The replica's appearance is its primary tool of deception. At a distance, or in passing, it is designed to be unremarkable, to blend in. However, upon closer, direct inspection, you will notice an unnerving perfection in its features. Its facial structure will be perfectly symmetrical, to a degree not found in nature or genetics. Its posture will be flawless, its spine perfectly straight, its shoulders perfectly level. Its gait will be unnaturally balanced, even on rough terrain. Human beings are creatures of subtle, endearing imperfect Iona's slightly crooked nose, one ear higher than the other, a tendency to favor one leg, a minor slouch. The replica lacks these tells. It is a mirror image folded down its center. If you encounter an individual whose face looks as though it were generated by a computer algorithm obsessed with perfect balance, you must immediately begin your disengagement protocol. This is your first and clearest sign. 7.2. The law of wasted motion. Observe its movements. Humans are biologically inefficient. We fidget. We scratch our noses. We run a hand through our hair. We shift our weight from foot to foot when standing still. We make thousands of small, unconscious, wasted adjustments throughout the day. The replica does not. Every movement it makes is deliberate, precise, and brutally efficient, as if it is operating on a limited power source and must conserve energy at all costs. It will turn its head in a single, smooth arc, without the corresponding shift of the shoulders. It will pick up an object with a direct, calculated motion. It moves with the unnerving grace of a machine, a predator that wastes nothing. It is a surgeon, but it is not here to heal. 7.3. The law of the unblinking gaze. The eyes are the most significant flaw in the design, the true, uncanny valley. The replica's eyes will be anatomically correct iris, pupil, sclera, but they are functionally wrong. Crucially, they do not blink at a natural or regular rate. It can hold a stare for minutes on end without any sign of discomfort or the need to moisten the eyeball. The pupils will not dilate or constrict correctly in response to changing light. They are fixed, glassy orbs. It is a gaze that looks at you, but not into you. It is not seeing you in the way a person does. It is processing data, scanning you like a barcode. Do not engage in a staring contest. You will lose, and in losing, you will reveal your knowledge of its nature. 7.4. The law of tonal void. If the entity speaks, it will be in a calm, even monotone. It may be able to mimic regional accents or specific cadences it has observed, but the mimicry is hollow. There is no emotion, no subtext, no inflection. There is no sarcasm, no joy, no anger, no hesitation. Its grammar will be impeccable, but it will lack the colloquialisms, the filler words, the ums and hs and likes that pepper natural human speech. It learns language from observation, but it does not understand the music behind the words. Its voice is a recording, played back without comprehension. Its questions will often be strangely direct and informational, lacking the finesse of human curiosity. What is the purpose of this designated trail? Is this the correct atmospheric condition to express enjoyment? Are you an employee of this park? 7.5. The law of environmental disconnect. The replica does not belong in this world, and on an instinctual level, the world knows it. The natural ecosystem will react to its presence. Wildlife will give it a wide berth. Birds will fall silent as it approaches. Squirrels and chipmunks will flee to shelter. Deer will bolt without provocation. You will not find it covered in the honest dust and grime of the trail. Its clothes will be inexplicably clean, its shoes free of mud, even in a downpour or a muddy field. It leaves no discernible scent for animals to track. It moves through the forest with an unnatural silence, never snapping a twig or rustling leaves underfoot. It is a ghost wearing a flesh suit, and nature itself recoils from its passage. 7.6. The law of the uncanny smile. This is its most disturbing and potentially aggressive display. Should the replica attempt to mimic a positive human emotion to put you at ease, such as happiness or friendliness, it will smile. The smile will be a grotesque parody. It will not reach its eyes. The muscles of the face will pull the lips back in a mechanical, unnatural fashion, often revealing too many teeth, or teeth that seem too uniform, too white, too perfect. The smile is a predatory gesture, a baring of teeth disguised as a welcome. Do not mistake it for an invitation. It is a threat display. It is a sign that it is attempting to manipulate you. If you see this smile, your observation period is over. You have been made. 7.7. The final protocol, passive disengagement. This is the most critical rule and must be followed without deviation. Under no circumstances are you to show aggression, fear, or overt recognition. Do not challenge it. Do not accuse it. Do not scream. And above all, do not run. To take any of these actions is to confirm its unnatural nature to it, and to mark yourself as a threat or, worse, an object of intense curiosity. Your only course of action is passive disengagement. Answer any of its questions simply, neutrally, and briefly. Yes. No. I don't know. Then, you must create a plausible reason to leave. I have to continue my patrol. I'm expected back at my station. I have a scheduled radio check-in. Turn slowly, deliberately, and walk away at a steady, normal pace. Do not look back until you are well out of its line of sight. It will watch you go. It is testing your reaction. Act like a sheep, even when you know you are staring directly at the wolf. I closed the book. The heavy leather cover fell shut with a soft thud that sounded like a gunshot in the silent cabin. My hand was trembling. The whiskey glass was rattling against my teeth. The elaborate prank theory had evaporated. There was a sincerity, a terrifying practicality to the words that felt far too real. This wasn't a joke. This was a survival guide. Suddenly, my cozy cabin, which had always been my sanctuary, felt like a glass cage. I found myself looking out the dark windows, not at the forest I loved, but at 100 million hiding places. The wind outside wasn't just wind anymore. It was a presence. Every shadow thrown by the swaying pines seemed to take on a human form, just at the edge of my vision. I stood up and walked around the cabin, checking the lock on the door, securing the latches on the windows. I told myself it was just Ranger folklore, a fantastic piece of creative writing designed to prey on the mind of a man living in isolation. I tried to reason with myself. But you can't unread something like that. I put the manual back in my pack, zipping it away, wanting it out of sight. But the rules were already loose in my head. They had been planted in my mind, a seed of paranoia, just waiting for the rain. Just waiting for the right conditions to sprout and take root. I wouldn't have to wait long. Several weeks passed. Autumn was bleeding into the landscape, painting the aspens in brilliant strokes of gold and orange. The air grew crisp. The park was quiet, with tourist season winding down. The memory of the strange manual had faded, becoming a quirky anecdote I might one day tell a fellow ranger over a beer. I was on a routine patrol along Ridgeback Trail, a narrow path that snaked along a high crest with breathtaking views of the Acheron River Valley below. It was late afternoon. The sun was low, casting long, distorted shadows across the trail. And that's when I saw him. About 50 yards ahead, a man was standing still, facing away from me, looking out over the valley. At first glance, nothing was out of the ordinary. He was dressed in standard hiking gear, a bright red jacket, dark pants, a small day pack. But as I got closer, a strange feeling began to prickle at the back of my neck. He was too still, not just admiring the view still, but statue still. There was no subtle shifting of weight, no turning of the head to take in the full panorama. He was frozen in a perfect, rigid posture. My steps, usually confident on the familiar trail, became more hesitant. The first rule from the manual flickered in my mind, unbidden. Law of wasted motion. I dismissed it. He's just a tourist, absorbed in the view. I cleared my throat, my voice louder than I intended in the silence. Afternoon. Great day for a hike, isn't it? The figure turned to face me. The movement was wrong. It wasn't a human turn, where the shoulders and hips move in sequence. His entire body rotated as a single unit, a smooth, fluid pivot on his heels. It was unnervingly graceful. My heart gave a hard thump against my ribs. Now he was facing me, and I got my first good look at him. And my blood ran cold. His face was perfect, symmetrical to a mathematical degree. A strong jawline, a straight nose, clear, unblemished skin. He was handsome, but in the way a mannequin is handsome. It was an artist's rendering of a human face, not a real one. The law of symmetry. His eyes locked onto mine. They were a pale, washed-out blue, and they didn't blink. Not once. They were just fixed on me, wide and inquisitive. The law of the unblinking gaze. A cold sweat started to form on my brow, despite the autumn chill. The rules were no longer just words on a page. They were a checklist, and I was ticking the boxes. It is an optimal day for this activity, he said. His voice. It was the final confirmation. It was a perfect, clear baritone, but utterly devoid of life. No warmth, no friendliness. Just a flat delivery of information. The law of tonal void. My mind was screaming. This is it. This is real. The manual is real. Every instinct I had was telling me to pull my bear spray, to shout, to run. But the last rule, the most important one, echoed in my head. Do not show fear. Do not run. Passive disengagement. I forced my own face into a mask of casual professionalism. I gave a tight, polite nod. Enjoy the view. I managed to say, my own voice sounding strained to my ears. I've got to finish my patrol route before dark. It was the lamest excuse, but it was all I could think of. I started to turn. Question, the replica said, its voice stopping me cold. I paused, but I didn't turn back around completely, just angled my head slightly. Are you enjoying your patrol? The question was so bizarre, so clinical. It wasn't small talk. It was data collection. It's my job, I said, keeping my answer short and neutral, just as the manual instructed. Then, I did the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I turned my back on it and started walking. Not running. Walking. A steady, measured pace. Every nerve ending in my body was on fire. I could feel its unblinking gaze burning into my back. I was convinced it was gliding silently up behind me, that I would feel a cold hand on my shoulder. I walked for what felt like an eternity, forcing myself not to speed up, not to glance over my shoulder. When I finally rounded a bend in the trail, putting a wall of rock and trees between us, I broke into a dead sprint. I didn't stop running until I was back at my truck, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the door open. As I sped away down the gravel road, I looked in my rearview mirror. The ridge was silhouetted against the setting sun. There was no sign of the man in the red jacket. It was as if he had never been there at all. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with the old leather manual open on my table, the lights on, and a shotgun resting across my lap. The wilderness was no longer my friend. It was hiding a predator I couldn't comprehend. The encounter on Ridgeback Trail changed everything. Paranoia became my constant companion. Every lone hiker I saw in the distance made my heart hammer. Every moment of silence felt charged with menace. I started seeing signs everywhere. A few weeks later, I was checking a series of wildlife cameras we had set up in a remote meadow known for its elk population. As I was swapping out an SD card, I noticed that the birdsong, usually a constant chorus in this area, had ceased. The air was heavy and still. That rule from the manual surfaced instantly, the law of environmental disconnect. I scanned the tree line, my hand resting on the hilt of the large knife I now carried on my belt. At the far edge of the meadow, partially obscured by the shadows of ancient cedars, I saw them. A family. A man, a woman, and 2 small children, having what looked like a picnic. But it was a twisted parody of a family picnic. They sat on a perfectly square blanket, each person positioned at a corner. They were all dressed in bright, clean clothes that had no place in the backcountry. They held sandwiches in their hands but weren't eating. They just sat there, frozen in a tableau of domestic bliss. As I watched, my blood turning to ice, the man turned his head to look at me. Then the woman. Then the 2 children. All in perfect, synchronized unison. Their heads swiveled with that same, smooth, unnatural motion as the hiker on the ridge. And then, they all smiled. It was the smile from the manual. The uncanny, terrifying smile. It was too wide, stretched across their perfectly symmetrical faces, showing teeth that were too white, too uniform. It was a silent, collective threat. The law of the uncanny smile. I didn't need another warning. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off them until the trees obscured my view. Then I turned and fled. When I reviewed the footage from the wildlife camera later, the card was blank. Not just empty of files, but corrupted. Unreadable. As if some force had wiped it clean. The replicas were learning. They were becoming more complex. A single hiker was one thing. A family unit was a terrifying escalation. They were observing human behavior and creating more elaborate charades. My fear drove me to obsession. I needed to know more. I spent my nights poring over the park's archives, digging through decades of old ranger logs, incident reports, and transfer requests. I was looking for a pattern, for any mention of strange encounters. Most of it was mundane. Bear sightings, lost hikers, budget reports. But then, I found a box of personal effects belonging to a ranger named Elias Miller. He had been the custodian of Outpost 3 in the late 80s and had, according to the official file, taken an abrupt early retirement due to personal reasons. Inside the box, tucked into an old copy of Walden, was a small, leather-bound journal. Most of the pages had been torn out, but a few fragmented entries remained, his handwriting shaky and desperate. October 12th, saw one by the creek today. It was trying to fish. It just stood in the water, plunging its hand in at random. It didn't seem to feel the cold. It watched me for a long time. The silence is the worst part. October 19th, there are more of them. They are no longer content to just mimic hikers. I saw one wearing a ranger's uniform. Not a new one. My old summer uniform that went missing from the line last month. The copy is getting better. They are learning us. November 3rd, it came to the cabin last night. Didn't knock. Just stood at the window. Its face. God, its face was almost right. It asked me if I was lonely. How could it know to ask that? I didn't answer. I just sat in the dark until it left. I can't stay here. This place is a hunting ground, and I'm not the hunter. November 5th, they can mimic voices now. Heard Sarah's voice on the radio, clear as day, asking for my location. Sarah's been in Denver for a month. It's a trap. They are setting traps. I have to leave. I will not be another missing persons case. I will not be their next skin. That last entry chilled me to the bone. Their next skin. What did that mean? The thought that these things weren't just observing, but potentially replacing, was a new dimension of horror. Ranger Miller hadn't retired. He had fled for his life. And the thing that drove him out was still here. It was watching me, learning me, just as it had learned him. The old manual wasn't just a guide. It was a baton, passed from one terrified custodian to the next. And now, it was my turn to hold it. The isolation of Outpost 3, once a comfort, now felt like a tomb. I was dozens of miles from help, surrounded by a wilderness that held a secret predator, a predator that was getting smarter, more daring, and was starting to focus its terrible, unblinking attention directly on me. The long, dark nights of winter were coming, and I had a sinking feeling that I was not going to be spending them alone. The first snow of the season came early that year, a thick, wet blanket that muffled the world in white. The park officially closed its deep country access. I was now completely, utterly alone. The gravel road to the central hub was treacherous, passable only by the station's heavy-duty truck, and even then, only on a clear day. For the most part, I was cut off. The days grew short, the nights impossibly long. I fell into a grim routine. I did my essential duties during the daylight hours, never straying too far from the station, the shotgun always in the rack in my truck. Every shadow, every gust of wind, every snap of a frozen branch sent my heart racing. I was living on a knife's edge of adrenaline and exhaustion. The nights were the worst. I would barricade the door, check the locks on the windows a dozen times, and sit with Miller's journal and the old manual, reading the same desperate words over and over again, trying to glean some new insight, some forgotten piece of advice that would save my life. The attack, and I can only call it a siege, began on the third night after the big snow. A storm had blown in, a blizzard that howled like a banshee, throwing sheets of snow and ice against the cabin. The power went out just after dusk, plunging me into a world of flickering lantern light and dancing shadows. The generator was useless, the fuel line had frozen solid. The radio was just static. I was an island in a sea of white fury. It started with a sound, a soft, rhythmic thump. Thump, thump against the west wall of the cabin. It wasn't the wind. This was deliberate. I grabbed my most powerful flashlight and the shotgun, my hands slick with sweat. My breath plumed in the cold air of the room. I crept to the window on that wall, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I wiped the condensation from the cold glass and peered out into the swirling maelstrom of snow. At first, I saw nothing. Then, the beam of my flashlight caught it. It was one of them, a replica, standing not 10 feet from my window. It was dressed as a hiker again, but the snow wasn't sticking to it. It just swirled around it, as if repelled by an invisible field. It was the one I'd seen on the ridge, I was sure of it. Its perfect, symmetrical face was pointed towards the cabin, and it was methodically, rhythmically, bumping its head against the wooden siding. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't trying to break in. It was an act of psychological warfare. A test. I stumbled back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't make a sound. The final protocol. Do not show fear. Do not acknowledge. An hour passed. The thumping stopped. For a moment, I allowed myself a sliver of hope. Maybe it was gone. Then, a new sound. A faint scratching at the back door. Like a dog wanting to be let in. Scratch. 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 Slow, deliberate, patient. I didn't move. I sat in my armchair in the center of the room, the shotgun across my lap, trying to control my breathing, trying to become a piece of the furniture. The scratching went on for what felt like a lifetime before it too fell silent. The silence that followed was worse than the sounds. My imagination filled the void with horrors. I pictured them circling the cabin, testing every lock, peering into every window with those dead, glassy eyes. And then I saw the face. It was at the window right next to me. I only caught it for a second in the lantern's guttering light. A face, pale and perfect, pressed against the glass. Its eyes were wide, and as they met mine, it did something new. It opened its mouth, and a cloud of vapor, which shouldn't have been possible, fogged the pain. It was mimicking breathing. It was learning. I flinched, a small, involuntary jerk. And I knew it saw. Because then, the smile appeared. That grotesque, too wide, predatory smile. The law of the uncanny smile. You have been made. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. The protocol had been breached. It knew that I knew. The game was over. And then, the voice came. It wasn't the flat, monotone voice from the ridge. This voice was different. It was warm, familiar, laced with concern. It was the voice of my supervisor, Frank, the head ranger from the central hub. Alex, the voice called out, seeming to come from just outside the front door. Alex, you in there? Son? The radio's been down. I got worried with this storm. Came to check on you. Open up. My mind reeled. Frank? Here? It was impossible. No one could have made it through this blizzard. It was a trick. It was the trap Elias Miller had written about in his journal. They can mimic voices now. Alex, come on. It's freezing out here. The voice pleaded, a perfect imitation of Frank's gruff, friendly tone. Just need to know you're all right. We can have a hot coffee and wait out the storm. It was a perfect lure. It was offering everything I wanted in that moment. Safety, companionship, and end to the terror. Every fiber of my being wanted to believe it, to run to the door and throw it open. But the manual. The manual was my anchor. Do not engage. Do not acknowledge. I stayed frozen in my chair, my knuckles white on the stock of the shotgun. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the voice. Don't be like that, Alex, Frank's voice said, the warmth now gone, replaced by a chilling, disappointed tone. I know you can hear me. Let me in. It's time to talk. Silence. I held my breath. Then, a new voice. A woman's voice. My mother's voice. Alex, honey, are you okay? I was so worried. A sob caught in my throat. This was a violation. A desecration of memory. They were reaching into my head, pulling out the people I trusted, the voices that meant safety, and weaponizing them against me. Let us in, Alex, said another voice. A chorus of voices. The hiker from the ridge. The family from the meadow. Frank. My mother. All speaking in unison, a layered, monstrous harmony that scraped at the inside of my skull. We just want to understand. We want to see how you work. Let us in. We want to be like you. That was it. The final, terrifying truth. They weren't just mimics. They were students. And I was the subject of their horrifying lesson. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I sat in the darkness and the cold, a lone man in a wooden box, besieged by monsters wearing the faces of friends and family. I focused on the one thing I had left, the final protocol. I made myself stone. I let the voices wash over me, a tide of psychological terror, and I held on. I don't know if I sat there for 3 hours or 10. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the storm, the voices, and the crushing, absolute certainty that if I made a single sound, the door would splinter and they would be upon me. And then, as the first, faint, gray light of dawn began to filter through the windows, it stopped. The voices ceased. The storm began to quiet its howling. A profound, deep silence fell over the world. I waited. I waited until the sun was fully up, casting a brilliant, painful glare across the fresh snow. Cautiously, I crept to the window. I looked out. There was nothing. No figures. No tracks. The snow around the cabin was a perfect, undisturbed sheet of white, as if nothing and no one had ever been there. It was all gone. All of it. Except for one thing. On the wooden siding of the cabin, right where the first replica had been thumping its head, was a series of faint, dark smudges. I went outside later, my whole body trembling, to look at them. They were greasy, oily marks, arranged in the unmistakable shape of a human forehead. I didn't last much longer at Acheron Forks. After the siege, the park was no longer a home. It was a cage I had happened to survive a night in. The beauty of the landscape was gone, replaced by a constant, gnawing dread. Every tree was a potential hiding place. Every silence was a prelude to a voice that wasn't real. I filed for a transfer, citing the isolation and the harsh winters. I didn't mention the replicas. Who would have believed me? They would have sent me for a psychiatric evaluation, and I would have been discredited, dismissed as a man who had cracked under the pressure of solitude. The secret of Acheron Forks had to be kept. The protocol had to be maintained. The day before I left, I returned to the old fire lookout tower on Whisperwind Pass. I walked up those groaning stairs one last time and opened the warped drawer of the old desk. I took out the dark green, leather-bound manual. With a pen from my pocket, I turned to the blank pages at the end of Chapter 7. My hand was shaking, but my purpose was clear. I was the new link in the chain. I had a duty to whoever came next. I added my own observations. Addendum, Ranger Alex K. They are learning. They can mimic the voices of loved ones and figures of authority. The mimicry is perfect. Do not trust your ears. Trust the silence. They can create more complex social units, like families. They are testing our responses to social cues. Their touch leaves a faint, oily residue. Check surfaces after a suspected encounter. They seem to be repelled by direct sunlight, or at least prefer the cover of dusk, night, and storms. Daylight is your safest time, but it is not a guarantee. Above all, the final protocol holds. Your silence is your only armor. Your anonymity is your only shield. You are not a ranger. You are a ghost. Act like it. I placed the manual back in the drawer, pushing it to the very back, covering it with the old maps, just as I had found it. It would wait there for the next custodian, the next poor soul who would be the unwitting guardian of this terrible secret. I work in a different park now. A smaller one, closer to civilization. It's mostly rolling hills and deciduous forests. It's tame, but I never feel safe. Sometimes, on a quiet day, I'll see a hiker standing a little too still on a distant hill, or I'll notice a family at a picnic site that seems just a little too perfect, and the cold dread returns. I walk away. I always just walk away. I don't know what they are, or where they come from. Are they aliens? Some kind of terrestrial evolution we don't understand? Are they projections? I don't have any answers. All I have is a set of rules, written in an old book, that kept me alive. So, when you're out there, in the deep places of the world, away from the noise and the crowds, I want you to remember my story. Enjoy the beauty, but But stay aware. Listen to the silence. And pay attention to the little details that are wrong. The person who is too clean, too perfect, too still. The smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Because the wilderness is vast, and it holds secrets much older and stranger than we can imagine. And some of them are watching us, learning from us, and trying to find a way in. Thank you for listening and for joining me here at the Wilderness Protocol. The world is full of unexplained things, and the deeper you go into the wild, the more you realize how little we truly know. If you have your own stories from the remote corners of the globe, experiences that defy easy explanation, I invite you to share them in the comments below. These stories deserve to be told. If you want to support the channel and hear more accounts from the wild, please consider liking this video and subscribing. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next dispatch. Stay safe out there and stay vigilant. I monitor the park's cameras. What I saw the trees do at night is impossible. Hello, and welcome back to the Wilderness Protocol. There's a common misconception about my line of work about the life of a park ranger. Most people picture me hiking beneath a canopy of green, breathing in the scent of pine and damp earth, a silent guardian of the wild. And for many years, that was my reality. I've told some of those stories here. The stories from the ground, from the heart of the deep woods. But the wilderness is evolving, and so are the ways we watch over it. Several years ago, after the incidents at Acheron Forks, I took a different kind of posting. A quieter one. I traded my hiking boots for an ergonomic chair and the vast, open sky for the cool, steady glow of a dozen monitors. I became a data analyst for the National Park Service, specifically assigned to the newly implemented Remote Wilderness Monitoring Initiative. It's a fancy title for a simple job. I watch the woods from 100 miles away. My domain is Pendleton Glades National Forest. It's not as jagged or overtly menacing as Acheron. It's an older, softer kind of wild. A sprawling, 2 million-acre expanse of rolling hills, ancient broadleaf forests, and mist-shrouded valleys. It's the kind of place that feels sleepy, ancient, a landscape that seems to have settled into a deep, unshakable slumber millennia ago. To keep an eye on such a vast and often inaccessible area, the service installed a network of over 300 high-definition, solar-powered observation cameras. They're strategically placed to monitor game trails, watch for the first wisps of a forest fire, and keep a digital eye on remote geological formations. Each camera records continuously, but to send that much data back to the central server is impossible. So, the system has a protocol. Every 24 hours, each camera automatically processes its footage into a compressed time-lapse file. 2 minutes of footage to represent an entire day. It's a brilliant system for data management. You can spot the slow creep of erosion, track the seasonal migration of elk herds, or watch a wildflower bloom and fade, all in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. For the first year, my job was a peaceful kind of monotony. I was a digital watchman. I cataloged files, flagged footage of rare bird sightings for the biology department, forwarded evidence of poaching to law enforcement, and learned the slow, silent rhythm of the forest as told by 1,000 sped-up sunrises and sunsets. I saw foxes darting through moonlit clearings, bears scratching their backs on ancient oaks, and clouds moving like brushstrokes across the canvas of the sky. It was a God's-eye view of the wilderness, and for a while, it was beautiful. It was safe. It was data. Cold, clean, predictable data. But the wilderness, it doesn't like being predictable. It has its own protocols, ancient ones. And sometimes, if you watch closely enough, the data shows you something that breaks all the rules. Something that wasn't meant to be seen. It started, as these things so often do, with a glitch. Not with a scream in the dark, or a shape half glimpsed between the trees. It began with the quiet, sterile beep of a system notification on a gray Tuesday afternoon. For nearly a year, this room had been my sanctuary. For white walls, the low, constant hum of server fans, and a constellation of 12 glowing monitors. This was my wilderness now. A digital forest where I tracked the migration of data packets instead of elk herds. My official title was Remote Wilderness Analyst for Pendleton Glades National Forest. My real job was to be a digital watchman, the sole pair of human eyes sorting through the silent, automated testimony of over 300 cameras. The system itself was a marvel of efficiency. Each camera, a solar-powered eye in the deep woods, would record its vigil. Then, once every 24 hours, at the stroke of midnight, it would perform a little piece of digital alchemy. It would compress an entire day, every sunrise, every passing cloud, every rustle of leaves into a 2-minute time-lapse file. It was the only way to manage the colossal flood of information. My days fell into a rhythm governed by this process. I was a professional observer of sped-up nature. I'd watch thunderheads gather and burst in seconds, see snow blanket a valley in a soft, white rush, and witness the slow, patient decay of a fallen log into rich earth, all before my coffee grew cold. It was methodical. It was predictable. And after my time at Acheron Forks, predictable was a comfort I clung to like a lifeline. My task that Tuesday was a routine data integrity check, a digital spring cleaning. My software diligently scoured the servers, flagging files that were corrupted, incomplete, or otherwise anomalous. Most were simple, explainable errors. CM 045.tlp.incmplet solar panel failing to charge after a week of dense fog. CM 219.tlp.uptime memory card likely fried by a nearby lightning strike. I'd log the error, schedule a remote reboot, and delete the useless file. Click, type, delete. The soothing monotony of a solvable problem. And then, one file popped up on my diagnostic screen, flagged with an error I hadn't seen before. CM 117.tlp.corrupt. Inconsistent spatiotemporal data. A mouthful of technical jargon. Spatiotemporal simply refers to space and time. The error meant the system believed there was a conflict, a disagreement, between the camera's physical location and the timeline of its recording. Usually, it was a simple thing. The camera's internal clock had desynchronized by a few seconds, or maybe a heavy bird had landed on it, causing a slight, jarring shift in its position. Camera 117. I pulled up its file. It was located deep in Sector 18, a place designated on the old park maps as the Sycamore Grove. It was a remote, unremarkable patch of forest, nestled in a shallow, marshy basin miles from any marked trail. It was named for a dense stand of enormous, ancient sycamore trees, whose mottled, bone-white bark gave the grove a strangely skeletal appearance, even in summer. There was no reason for anyone to go there. According to the visitor logs and trail counters, no one ever did. It was a forgotten corner of the forest, watching itself. My protocol was to simply delete the corrupted file and log the hardware for a physical inspection, which might happen in 6 months, if at all. But the error message, inconsistent spatiotemporal data. It was just unusual enough. Curiosity, that old, dangerous impulse, got the better of me. Instead of deleting it, I bypassed the corruption flag and forced the file to play. The time-lapse opened as expected. My screen filled with the silent, ghostly dance of the Sycamore Grove. The sun, a searing white comet, arced across the upper frame. Shadows stretched from the trees like long, black fingers, then retreated just as quickly. A light rain began to fall around midday, appearing on the time-lapse as a series of shimmering, staccato flashes against the lens. And the trees, the ancient sycamores. They stood silent sentinel, their pale, patchwork bark stark against the gloomy backdrop of the woods. I watched the full 2-minute cycle, my eyes scanning for the anomaly. Nothing. No deer stepping delicately through the undergrowth. No bears ambling past. Not even a squirrel. The grove was utterly still, devoid of any obvious life. Just the trees, the rain, and the frantic, sped-up passing of a day. I sighed, a little disappointed. It was just a boring, corrupted file. I reached for the delete key, but I paused. My hand hovered over the keyboard. It was a feeling more than a sight. A subtle, pervasive sense of wrongness. You know that feeling when you walk into a room you've been in 1,000 times, and a single piece of furniture has been moved just an inch? You don't consciously register the change, but some primitive, pattern-seeking part of your brain begins to scream that the familiar landscape is broken. It was like that, an itch at the back of my mind. I dragged the playback slider back to the beginning and played the file again. This time, I didn't watch the whole frame. I focused. I chose a specific landmark, an anchor point. On the left side of the frame, there was a distinctive cluster of 3 enormous sycamores. 2 stood close together, and a third, even larger one, stood slightly apart from them, its massive white trunk scarred with a dark, lightning-shaped mark. I made that scarred tree my focus. I watched it as the day sped by. Sunrise. Morning. The shadows shortened. The rain began to fall. The light grew dim as heavy clouds rolled in. And it was there, in the deepest gloom of the afternoon, that it happened. The change was almost imperceptible, masked perfectly by the shifting shadows and the strobing flashes of rain on the lens. In the first half of the time-lapse, the large, scarred tree was positioned clearly to the right of the other 2. In the second half, after the period of deep shadow, it was on the left. I froze, my hand still hovering over the mouse. My breathing stopped. That was impossible. I grabbed the playback slider and scrubbed the video back and forth, my eyes glued to the screen. My mind raced, desperately trying to find the flaw in my own observation. It had to be a trick of the light, a distortion of the lens. But it wasn't. The tree didn't slide. It didn't drift. It jumped. One frame, it was here. The next, in a flicker of shadow, it was there. A positional shift of at least 10 feet. My logical mind, the part of me that had been trained for years to find rational, technical explanations, kicked into overdrive. It had to be a digital artifact. A severe compression error. The inconsistent spatiotemporal data flag was proof. The software had failed. It must have tried to stitch together 2 completely different moments in time, or perhaps even footage from 2 different days, and in doing so, created a visual jump cut. That was the only explanation that made any sense. A tree that large, with roots as deep as a house is tall, does not simply move. But another part of me, a colder, older part that remembered the feel of being watched in the deep woods of Acheron, felt a tendril of icy dread. It remembered that the wilderness does not always obey the rules of logic. I took a deep, shaky breath and forced myself back into the role of the dispassionate analyst. I wrote my report, my fingers stiff on the keyboard. CM117.tlp file flagged for severe spatiotemporal corruption. Visual data suggests significant spatial displacement of static objects, likely due to a critical software failure in the compression algorithm. Recommend immediate remote diagnostic and future software patch to address potential frame stitching errors. I tried to make it sound as boring and technical as possible. I was trying to convince myself as much as the system log. I was putting the anomaly in a box, labeling it with jargon, and shutting the lid. But I couldn't let it go. For the rest of the week, that image was burned into my mind. The ghost white tree, jumping in the shadows. I found myself pulling up the live, real-time feed from camera 117 multiple times a day. Each time, the grove was exactly as it should be. The scarred sycamore stood placidly to the right of its companions, utterly, defiantly immobile. The live feed mocked me with its perfect normalcy, making me question what I had seen. Was I just tired? Staring at screens for too long? Was I letting my past experiences color my judgment, seeing monsters in data noise? I almost convinced myself. Almost. Then, on Friday afternoon, another alert chimed. It was a different camera, a different sector, and a different error. CM204.tlp.anomaly, unexplained luminance variance. My heart started to beat a little faster. Camera 204. I knew that one. It was positioned nearly 20 miles south of the Sycamore Grove, bolted to a rock face overlooking a high, windswept ridge known as the Serpent Spine. Unexplained luminance variance. A simple error, usually. It meant a sudden, drastic change in the light levels that couldn't be explained by the sun's position or the weather data. I opened the file. It was another dreary, overcast day on the ridge. The time-lapse began its frantic 2-minute journey. The ridge was populated by ancient, gnarled pines, their trunks twisted by centuries of wind, their branches like crooked arms reaching for the gray sky. As I watched the day unfold, I saw the anomaly. For a period of about 3 hours in the afternoon, from roughly 2 p.m. to 5 p.m., the light in the footage dimmed significantly. It was as if a single, massive, unmoving storm cloud had parked itself directly over the camera, plunging the ridge into a deep twilight. But that was impossible. A cloud that large and that stationary would have been a major weather event. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I pulled up the time-lapse files from the 3 nearest cameras, camera 203, 205, and 206. Their vantage points were all within 5 miles of the Serpent Spine. All 3 of their time-lapse showed the same thing, a uniformly gray, overcast sky. There was no localized storm, no giant, stationary cloud. I went back to the footage from camera 204. If the darkness wasn't coming from the sky, then where was it coming from? I played the file again, but this time, I wasn't looking at the sky. I was looking at the trees. And then I saw it, and the air rushed out of my lungs. The pines. The ancient, twisted pines in the foreground, the ones nearest the camera. At the beginning of the time-lapse, they were just part of the landscape. But as the afternoon wore on, they began to change. Slowly, imperceptibly. They had leaned in. Their gnarled trunks had bowed inwards, towards the camera. Their thick, needle-laden branches had stretched and intertwined, weaving themselves together. They had collectively formed a dense, light-blocking roof directly over the camera lens. Then, as evening approached, just as slowly, just as imperceptibly, they had leaned back, untangling themselves, retreating to their original, natural-looking positions. This was not a glitch. A glitch is random. An error is a singular, explainable event. This was a pattern. This was coordinated. A tree jumping 10 feet in a forgotten grove could be a software bug. But 20 miles away, a group of different trees working together to deliberately block out the sun? That was something else. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, the hum of the servers suddenly sounding loud and menacing. The sterile, safe walls of my office felt thin, like paper. The 2 incidents, the 2 impossible data points, connected in my mind. The sycamore that jumped. The pines that formed a canopy. They were isolated events, but they told a single, unified story. A story that defied all laws of biology and physics. My hands were cold. The professional detachment I had so carefully cultivated shattered into a million pieces. I was left with a single, stark, terrifying conclusion. The trees were moving. Vance's logs changed everything. My world, which had already been tilted on its axis by the impossible footage, was now sent into a freefall. The man I had dismissed as a reclusive tech nerd who had simply retired was, in fact, the first casualty of this silent war. He wasn't a ghost in the machine. He was a ghost consumed by it. He had walked willingly into the hunting ground, and the forest, with its patient, silent intelligence, had simply closed the door behind him. I felt a strange, chilling sense of inheritance. Vance hadn't just left behind a hidden journal. He had left me his post. He had passed on the terrible responsibility of being the soul watcher, the unwilling custodian of a secret that could break a person's mind. The secret that Pendleton Glades was not a park. It was a single, living organism. A predator that operated on a timescale so slow, so vast, that its movements were invisible to the fleeting lifespan of a human being. And for some reason, after centuries or perhaps millennia of slumber, it was waking up. My work was no longer a job. It became a frantic, desperate obsession. I abandoned all my routine tasks. The data integrity checks, the wildlife cataloging, the reports on trail erosion, they all seemed absurdly trivial now. It was like polishing the brass on the Titanic. My days, and increasingly my nights, were spent in a state of feverish focus. I became an archaeologist of the digital archives, sifting through petabytes of forgotten data, hunting for the fossilized footprints of impossible movements. I was no longer just looking for the system's own flagged files. That was the mistake. The system was designed to see glitches. It couldn't comprehend intent. The forest was too smart, too subtle for my algorithms. So I started hunting manually. I'd pull up the time-lapse from a specific sector, sometimes dozens of them from the same week, and display them on multiple monitors. I'd sit in the dark, my face illuminated by the glow, and I'd watch them all simultaneously. It was maddening work, like trying to spot a single doctored frame in 1,000 hours of film. I was looking for the subtle tells. The shadow of a tree that fell at a slightly wrong angle. A gap between two poplars that seemed just a little wider than it was the day before. A lone redwood on a mountainside whose pattern of bark seemed to have rotated a few degrees. Most of the time, I found nothing. Hours would blur into a meaningless stream of sped-up sunrises and sunsets. Doubt would creep in, a cold, insidious whisper. You're imagining it. You're seeing patterns in the noise. Vance was a brilliant man, but he was isolated. He cracked. And now you're following him down the same rabbit hole. But then, just as I was about to give in to the exhaustion, I would find one. A flicker of wrongness. A piece that didn't fit. In the northern meadows, a vast, open expanse of grasslands dotted with groves of aspen trees, I found a pattern. The aspens in this region are known for being clonal colonies, connected by a single root system. They are, in a sense, a single organism. And they were acting like it. During the week of a full moon, I watched in horrified fascination as a grove of them, over the course of 3 nights, slowly drew themselves together. They didn't just lean. Their trunks, pale and slender, seemed to glide over the soil, closing the gaps between them until they formed a tight, defensive-looking huddle, like a herd of animals seeking protection from a predator. Then, as the moon waned, they would slowly drift apart again, back to their natural, scattered positions. What were they afraid of? Or what were they hiding? In another sector, along the banks of the winding Serenity River, stood a line of tall, straight poplar trees. Over the course of 6 months, a period I could only track by comparing footage from the spring with archives from the previous autumn, the trees had completely rearranged themselves. What was once a haphazard, natural-looking clump had been transformed into a perfectly straight, evenly spaced line, like soldiers on parade. It was a clear, deliberate act of landscaping on a monumental scale. It was a border, a fence. They were marking a territory. The evidence was mounting, scattered across the park's digital history like a hidden constellation of terror. And it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. This was not a new phenomenon. The forest had been doing this for years, maybe decades. It had been moving, hunting, and thinking long before the first camera was ever installed. How? How had no one else noticed? How could something so monumental go completely unseen? The answer, I suspected, was twofold. First, the sheer scale and patience of it. The forest operated on a geological timescale. Its movements were so slow, so gradual, that a ranger walking the same trail every day would never notice a tree had shifted 10 feet over the course of a year. Their brain would simply accept the new landscape as the way it had always been. It was the ultimate camouflage. The second reason was Arthur Vance himself. He hadn't just discovered the phenomenon. He had actively hidden it. I started digging again, not in the archives, but in the system architecture itself, into the deep-level code that Vance had so brilliantly written. He had been a ghost in the machine long before I was. He had built the house, and he knew all its secret passages. I found them buried in the source code for the time-lapse compression algorithm. There were lines of code, elegantly disguised as error-handling subroutines that had only one purpose, to identify and suppress the evidence of anomalous arboreal migration. If the algorithm detected a large-scale, coordinated movement like the pines on Serpent's spine forming their labyrinth, it was programmed to automatically corrupt the file. It would introduce digital artifacts, pixelation, and visual snow, rendering the footage unwatchable. It would then flag the file with a mundane error like lens obstruction or signal interference. For smaller, more subtle movements, the code was even more insidious. It would subtly warp the frames before and after the movement, creating a smooth, artificial transition that would make the shift appear as a natural sway or a trick of the light. Vance hadn't just been a watchman. He had been a censor, a curator of a carefully sanitized version of reality. He had seen the truth, been horrified by it, and had dedicated the last years of his life to ensuring no one else ever would. He was trying to protect the world from this knowledge. Or maybe he was just trying to protect himself from being labeled a madman. Why did he stop? Why did he finally walk into the woods? Did the burden become too much? Or did the forest, with its ancient, calling intelligence, finally wear down his defenses? As I stripped his suppression code from the system, I felt like I was breaking a sacred vow. I was undoing his life's work. But I had to. I had to see. I had to know the full extent of what we were dealing with. With Vance's digital blindfolds removed, the system began to screen. My diagnostic monitor, once a placid field of green, OK statuses, lit up like a Christmas tree from hell. Dozens of files, every single day, were now being flagged with the inconsistent spatiotemporal data error. The true scope of the activity was staggering. The forest wasn't just moving in isolated pockets. It was all moving. The entire park was in a constant state of subtle, terrifying flux. I was no longer an analyst. I was the lone air traffic controller in an airport where all the planes were alive, and the runways were rearranging themselves moment by moment. The ghost of Arthur Vance loomed over me, a silent, cautionary tale. He had seen this raw, unfiltered truth, and it had led him to his doom. And now, it was my turn to stare into the abyss. Except I knew something he didn't. I knew what the abyss was capable of, and I had his journal, his desperate, final words, as my only guide. He had been the predecessor. He was the ghost. And I, his unwitting successor, was now tasked with facing the monster he had tried so hard to hide. My work became an obsession. My predecessor, Arthur Vance, was no longer just a name in a personnel file. He was a ghost haunting the circuitry of the very system I was now trapped in. He had seen the truth and had tried to bury it, encoding his fear into lines of elegant, deceptive code. As I peeled back those layers, I felt I was desecrating a tomb, but I had no choice. I had to know what he knew. I had to understand what I was up against. And then I found it. Buried deeper than any of the suppression scripts, hidden in a password-protected partition of the main server that was itself disguised as a system backup, was a folder. It was labeled simply, AV Observations. My hands trembled as I typed in the master override password. The folder opened. It contained a single, heavily encrypted text file. It wasn't a system log or a piece of code. It took me the better part of an anxious, caffeine-fueled hour to break the encryption. When the text finally resolved on my screen, clean and stark against the black background, my breath caught in my throat. It was a journal. Arthur Vance's secret log. The personal testimony of the first man to stare into the abyss of Pendleton Glades. As I began to read, the low hum of the servers around me seemed to fade away, replaced by the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. The man I had imagined as a simple tech nerd was revealed to be something else entirely. The first witness to this silent, creeping horror. The first custodian of this impossible secret. I'm going to read you his entries, exactly as I read them that night, alone in the glow of the monitor. Entry 01, September 14th. Log entry, initial anomaly. I've encountered a persistent and frankly fascinating bug in the time-lapse compression algorithm. Specifically in Sector 18, the area mapped as the Sycamore Grove. The algorithm is registering spatio-temporal conflicts, suggesting that large, static objects are undergoing minor positional shifts between frames. My initial hypothesis was seismic activity localized microtremors causing the camera housing to shift. However, the onboard accelerometers show no such movement, even at the highest sensitivity. An alternative hypothesis is a form of atmospheric lensing or an extreme temperature gradient causing a mirage effect, distorting the camera's perception. The phenomenon is subtle, almost undetectable to the naked eye without frame-by-frame analysis. But it is consistent. I flagged the sector for focused monitoring. This is a fascinating problem. I remember reading that first entry and feeling a chill of recognition. A fascinating problem. That was exactly how I had approached it at first. The cool, detached curiosity of a scientist facing an intellectual puzzle. He was me, 3 years ago. He was standing at the very edge of the rabbit hole, peering in with academic interest, completely unaware of the depths below. Entry 02, November 2nd. Log entry. Hypotheses refuted. The atmospheric lensing theory is incorrect. The shifts occur regardless of weather conditions, time of day, or temperature. The seismic theory is also definitively out. I cross-referenced 3 months of data with USGS geological surveys, and Pendleton has been seismically inert for decades. I am now forced to consider a more unconventional possibility. The data, when stripped of all prejudice and preconception, suggests a single, impossible conclusion. The trees themselves are moving. I have isolated 12 clear instances of what I am now classifying as anomalous arboreal migration, or AAM. The movement is minimal, a few feet over a 24-hour period, in most cases, but it appears to be deliberate. They seem to move most actively during periods of low light and heavy precipitation, as if the rain and shadows provide some form of cover. This is, of course, insane, but I must follow the data, wherever it leads. I have begun writing a custom tracking script to analyze the trajectories of these movements. I feel like a biologist who has just discovered an entirely new phylum of life. Or a madman. There it was. Anomalous arboreal migration. He'd even given it a name. He tried to classify it, to put it into a neat, scientific box, just as I had. Reading his words, I felt a strange sense of validation mixed with absolute terror. I wasn't crazy. This was real. And Arthur Vance had seen it long before I had. He'd already walked the path I was just beginning to explore. Entry 03, January 21st. Log entry. The sycamore script. The tracking script is yielding results. Frightening results. The migration is not random. There is a terrifying, coordinated intelligence at play. The sycamores in the grove, they are not just moving, they are forming patterns. Complex, geometric patterns. Over the course of a week, I watched them arrange themselves into a perfect, massive circle. The week after, it was a spiral. Last night, they formed a series of flawless concentric squares. The patterns hold for a day, sometimes two, then dissolve back into a chaotic, natural-looking distribution. It is a language. I am convinced of it. A form of communication, written in bark and root on a scale so vast and patient that it's completely invisible to the naked human eye. I have started calling it the sycamore script. I feel a profound, chilling sense of trespassing. We placed our cameras in their sanctuary, in their private ballroom, and we are unwittingly reading their mail. My hands were cold as I read that. A script. A language. The thought was staggering. This wasn't just a physical anomaly, it was a sign of intelligence. An ancient, alien intelligence that communicated by rearranging the very landscape. The grove wasn't just a grove. It was a chalkboard. A canvas. And the message wasn't for us. Entry 04, March 12th. Log entry. The phenomenon is spreading. Or perhaps my perception is just widening. My script is now flagging instances of AAM all over the park. The ancient redwoods on the western slopes. The riverside poplars in the southern valley. The aspens in the high meadows. It's not just the sycamores. It's as if the entire forest is engaged in a secret, coordinated effort. They seem to be creating pathways. Over weeks, I've watched as trees slowly shift aside, forming clear, wide corridors through what was once impassable terrain, only for these new paths to close up again days later. What are they making way for? Or what are they trying to lead somewhere? I checked the park's missing persons database today. A foolish, morbid impulse. A hiker named Julian Croft went missing 5 years ago. His last known location was an off-trail route he was attempting near the Serpent's Spine. My script flagged that exact area for significant AAM activity in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. The time-lapse from that period are grainy, but they show the pines had formed a perfect, narrow channel, leading directly away from the established trail towards the edge of a ravine. The official report says he slipped and fell. An accident. But watching the footage, it doesn't look like an accident. It looks like they opened a door for him, and then closed it behind him. I had to stand up and walk around my small office after that one. My heart was hammering. This was the first link. The first concrete connection between the abstract, creeping horror of the moving trees and a real, human tragedy. Julian Croft. His name was a ghost on a page, but his death suddenly felt immediate and terrifyingly deliberate. The forest hadn't just been moving. It had been setting a trap. Entry 05, May 30th. Log entry. The hunting ground. I have captured something that I know will haunt me until the day I die. Camera 072, deep in the eastern wetlands. My script flagged it for extreme, rapid AAM. The time-lapse from yesterday shows a cluster of old willow trees performing a complex, horrifying maneuver. They slowly, over the course of the afternoon, bent their trunks and intertwined their weeping branches to form a dense, inescapable cage about 20 feet in diameter. The entrance was a small, inviting gap, facing a well-worn game trail. At dusk, a mature bull elk, a magnificent animal, wandered down the trail. It saw the gap in the willows, perhaps sensing a sheltered place to rest for the night, and it stepped inside. The moment it was fully within the enclosure, the time-lapse flickered. A single frame of pure digital snow. Corruption the system recorded as being caused by extreme, rapid motion. In the very next frame, the gap was gone. The willows had snapped shut, forming an impenetrable, interwoven wall of wood. The rest of the time-lapse is just the silent willow cage, standing still under the moon. This morning's time-lapse shows the willows have returned to their original, placid positions. There is no sign of the elk. Not a bone, not a tuft of fur, not a single drop of blood on the ground. The earth is undisturbed. It was not just taken. It was erased. Consumed. My God. They're not dancing. They're not riding. They're hunting. The entire forest is a patient, living predator, and we are living inside its stomach. Consumed. That word echoed in the silent room. Vance's scientific curiosity was gone, replaced by pure, primal terror. And I felt it with him. This was the true purpose. It wasn't communication. It wasn't ritual. It was predation. The whole park, this beautiful, sprawling expanse of nature, was nothing more than the digestive tract of an ancient, unknowable creature. Entry 06, June 15th. Log entry. They know. I am certain of it now. They know we are watching. The incidents are becoming more performative, more brazen. Camera 117, the original Sycamore Grove camera, recorded something new last night. The trees didn't form a geometric pattern. They formed a single, massive shape. It took me hours of staring at the image, at the negative space between the trunks, to realize what I was looking at. The trees had arranged themselves to form a perfect silhouette of a human figure. A giant, 60-foot-tall stick man, standing in the middle of the grove. And it was pointed directly at the camera. It wasn't a pattern. It was a message. A crude, terrifying drawing. And the subject of the drawing was us. It was a symbol of their awareness. They know what we look like, and they know where our eye in the sky is. Today, the live camera feed from 117 is dead. The log says, catastrophic hardware failure. The remote diagnostic shows the lens is shattered. Something hit it. Something thrown with immense force from within the grove. A shiver traced its way down my spine. The forest wasn't just intelligent, it was hostile. It had looked back through the camera and had swatted it from the wall like a man swatting a fly. The feeling of being watched, a feeling I knew all too well, was no longer a feeling. It was a confirmed fact. They were watching the watchers. Entry 07, July 1st. Log entry. The call. I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see the silent, shifting trees. The hum of the servers sounds like whispering. I keep reviewing the footage, trying to understand the purpose, the mechanism. Is it a hive mind? A subterranean mycelial network acting as a collective nervous system? Is it something older than biology itself? Lately I've been feeling a strange pull, a desire to go there, to see it for myself, to stand in the sycamore grove and just watch. I know it's insane. I know what happened to Julian Croft and what happened to the elk. But the data isn't enough anymore. The screens feel like a prison. I need to feel it. I need to stand on the ground and know if the earth trembles when they move. The park is a living thing, and I think it's calling to me. I've put in for a week of personal leave. I'm going hiking. I'm going to Pendleton Glades. I just need to see. That was the last entry. I sat back in my chair, the office suddenly feeling colder, emptier. A tomb. Arthur Vance didn't take medical retirement. He didn't crack under the pressure. He was lured away. The forest had whispered to him through the data, and he had answered its call. He walked into the woods to see the impossible, and the impossible had swallowed him whole. He became another data point, another ghost. And he had left me his legacy, not just his research, but his burden. The terrible, crushing weight of his knowledge. The knowledge that the forest I was paid to watch was, in fact, watching me back. And now, it knew my name. After reading the last of Arthur Vance's logs, the nature of my job and my life was irrevocably altered. The ghost of my predecessor wasn't a warning to stay away. It was a map of the battlefield. Vance had discovered the monster, documented its habits, and then, in a final, fatal act of curiosity, he had fed himself to it. I would not make the same mistake. My paranoia was no longer a suspicion. It was a validated, operational reality. The forest wasn't just a collection of flora and fauna. It was a singular, conscious entity. A predator that operated on a timescale so slow it was almost imperceptible. In my little office, this climate-controlled box 100 miles away, was the only watchtower on its hunting grounds. I spent the next few weeks building on Vance's work, upgrading his abandoned tracking scripts, creating a comprehensive threat assessment map of Pendleton Glades. I used his classification, anomalous arboreal migration, and fed years of archived footage into a new learning algorithm. The system began to paint a terrifying picture. It highlighted certain areas in pulsing shades of red. I designated these red zones the Sycamore Grove, the Willow Marsh where the elk had vanished, and a handful of others. These were the places where the AAM was most frequent, most complex, and most aggressive. These were the forest's favorite killing fields. With a cold, sinking feeling, I overlaid the park's official trail maps onto my new threat matrix. My blood ran cold. 3 of the park's most popular backcountry trails, paths hiked by thousands of people every year, cut directly through the heart of my red zones. Countless innocent hikers had walked, laughing and taking pictures, through the jaws of the beast, and had only survived because the beast had chosen not to bite. A crushing weight of responsibility settled on me. I was the only person on the planet who knew. I couldn't go to my superiors. They'd think I was insane, just as they probably thought Vance was before he retired. My boss, the trees are moving and they're eating hikers. I would be in a padded room before lunch, and the watchtower would be empty. So, I did the only thing I could. I watched. I became a digital Cerberus, guarding the gates of a hell that no one else knew existed. I configured my system to sound an alarm, a loud, klaxon-like wail that would only trigger for me if AAM activity in a red zone crossed a critical threshold. I monitored the red zones with a feverish, sleep-deprived intensity, my eyes scanning for the telltale signs of a hunt being prepared. For months, things were quiet. The AAM was still happening, a constant, low-level hum of movement across the park, but it was background noise. The tree shifted and settled, a sleeping giant muttering in its slumber. Tourist season began, and I watched, my heart in my throat, as thousands of hikers blissfully wandered through the woods, completely unaware of the ground they stood on, or the intelligence that watched them from every leaf and branch. The alert came in late August. On a hot, humid Thursday afternoon, I was reviewing some mundane footage of riverbank erosion when the klaxon blared through my office, a sound so loud and sudden it made me jolt out of my chair. My monitors all flashed red, displaying a single, terrifying message. Cascading AAM event detected. Sector 24, Serpent Spine. Threat level, critical. The Serpent Spine. Vance's logs flashed in my mind. The place where the hiker, Julian Croft, had disappeared 5 years earlier. The place where the pines had opened a door for him. My hands flew across the keyboard, sweat beading on my forehead. I pulled up the time-lapse from all 4 cameras along that section of the ridge. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was happening. A coordinated, large-scale movement, far more complex than anything I had seen before. Dozens of ancient, gnarled pines were on the move. They weren't just forming a simple channel or a cage. This was more complex, more artistic, more horrifying. They were creating a labyrinth. Over the course of the previous 72 hours, the trees lining a half-mile stretch of the well-marked trail had slowly, methodically shifted. In the time-lapse, it looked like a monstrous ballet. They uprooted themselves from the rocky soil with a silent, unnatural smoothness, gliding over the ground to new positions as if they were pieces on a chessboard. They were creating false trails, dead ends, and looping paths designed to confuse and disorient any hiker who entered. They were turning a clearly marked, easy-to-follow trail into an inescapable, organic maze. The entrance was wide and inviting, but the heart of the maze was a knot of impenetrable, interwoven wood. I frantically checked the trail registry logs. The Park Service required all backcountry hikers to register their route and carry a GPS locator. A family of 4, a husband and wife, Mark and Sarah Jennings, and their 2 teenage children had registered to hike the Serpent Spine Trail that very morning. Their itinerary showed they were due to enter the newly formed labyrinth section around noon. It was 11:45 a.m. They were minutes away from walking into the trap. My mind raced. I had to warn someone. I brought up the park's radio frequency panel, intending to place an emergency call to the nearest ranger station. Static. A loud, hissing wall of white noise on every single channel. I tried the emergency frequencies. More static. I frantically ran a system diagnostic. All external communication systems were down. A single, cryptic message flashed on the screen. Severe localized atmospheric disturbance. My blood turned to ice. I switched to the live feed from the camera at the entrance to the ridge. The sky above the Serpent Spine, a sky that should have been blue and clear, was a strange, sickly yellow-green, a bruised color I had never seen in nature. It was the same phenomenon Vance had described in his logs. The forest was creating its own weather. It was generating an electromagnetic field, cutting off communications. It was isolating its prey. Panic, cold and absolute, threatened to overwhelm me. The Jennings family was walking into a trap, and I was the only person on Earth who knew it. I was 100 miles away, helpless, watching them on a screen. I thought of Vance. I thought of the elk. I thought of the final protocol from my time at Acheron. Act like a sheep, even when you know you were staring directly at the wolf. But that was for personal survival. This was different. I wasn't the one in the crosshairs. They were. I couldn't just sit here and watch a family be erased. I wouldn't. My mind raced, desperately searching for a solution, for any way to interact with the park from my remote office. There had to be something. And then I remembered. Buried in the system manuals, a system of last resort, rarely used and almost forgotten. The Emergency Geological Alert System. It was a brute force tool designed to warn hikers of sudden, unpredictable geological events, rock slides, flash floods, sinkholes. From my terminal, I could trigger localized sirens installed at major trailheads, and, more importantly, I could force push a text-based alert directly to the GPS devices that the park rented to backcountry hikers. The Jennings family had rented one. It was a long shot, a desperate, digital Hail Mary, but it was my only shot. I knew I couldn't write, "The trees are alive, and they want to eat you." I needed a plausible, terrifying threat. A lie that would make any sane person turn and run without a second thought. I quickly drew a virtual polygon on the threat map, encompassing the entire half-mile labyrinth zone. Then I began to type the alert, my fingers flying across the keys, slick with sweat. Emergency alert. Urgent. Geological instability detected. Serpent Spine Trail, mile markers 5 to 6. Imminent danger of catastrophic rockslide and fissure formation. High concentrations of hydrogen sulfide gas detected. Air is toxic. Area is unstable. Evacuate immediately. Do not proceed. Your life is in danger. Evacuate immediately. It was a cocktail of geological horrors. A symphony of panic-inducing keywords. But I needed to be sure. I slammed my finger down on the send button. For a moment, nothing happened. The progress bar on my screen seemed to hang for an eternity. Then, a confirmation message flashed in green. Alert dispatched. Message received by Unit GPS 07B. I switched to the live feed from the camera just at the entrance to the labyrinth. My breath hitched in my chest. There they were. The Jennings family. They were about 100 yards from the entrance, laughing, the father pointing at something off camera. They were so blissfully unaware. I watched, my entire body tense, my face inches from the screen, my hands gripping the edge of my desk. They started walking again. Closer. Closer to the mouth of the maze. See it? I whispered at the screen, my voice a raw, desperate rasp. Please, just look at your device. As if he heard me, the father, Mark Jennings, walking in the lead, slowed down. He stopped. He tilted his head, reaching into the pocket of his hiking shorts. He pulled out the small, black GPS unit. He stared at it. His relaxed, smiling expression vanished, replaced by a look of confusion, then dawning horror. He yelled something to his wife. She ran up to him, and they both looked down at the screen. I could see the panic wash over them. The father turned and pointed frantically back the way they came, his movements sharp and urgent. He wasn't taking any chances. He grabbed his son's arm, and the four of them turned and began walking, almost jogging away from the trap, away from the labyrinth. I slumped back in my chair, a wave of relief so powerful it left me dizzy and nauseous. I watched on the screen until they were just small specks in the distance, safe. I didn't log off that night. I didn't sleep. I kept the cameras on that sector running, my eyes glued to the feeds. The next morning, I pulled up the new time-lapse, the one covering the 24 hours after my intervention, and I saw the most soul-crushing thing yet. The trees in the labyrinth, they began to move again, but they weren't resetting the trap. They weren't preparing for another victim. They were unraveling. As if acting on a single, silent command, they began to retreat. Slowly, smoothly, they glided back to their original positions along the trail. The false paths vanished. The dead ends opened up. The maze dissolved back into a simple, unassuming hiking trail. It was a retreat. It looked like a sigh of disappointment, written in bark and leaves. The forest had set the table for a feast, and I had knocked it over. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the entity in Pendleton Glades now knew of my existence. I wasn't just an eye in the sky anymore. I was an active player on the board, and I had just made a very powerful, very ancient enemy. The incident at the Serpent Spine was a turning point. A declaration of war I had made from 100 miles away, with nothing but a keyboard and a lie. After I watched the labyrinth unravel, watched the forest retreat in what I could only interpret as a silent, frustrated sigh, the nature of my existence changed. I was no longer a passive observer, a terrified archivist of horrors. I had intervened. I had chosen a side. I had become a combatant in a silent, secret war. My job was no longer about data analysis or monitoring wildlife. It was about intervention. It was about sabotage. I am the ghost in the machine, the park's secret shepherd. In the weeks and months that followed, I established what I now call the Vance Miller Protocol, named for my predecessor and for myself, the two unwilling custodians of this terrible secret. It's a system of checks and balances, of plausible deniability, designed for a single purpose, to keep humanity out of the forest's ever-watchful jaws. My office is no longer just a monitoring station, it is a command center. My upgraded algorithms, built on the bones of Vance's work, now run constantly, a vigilant, sleepless network of digital tripwires. They no longer just watch for movement, they analyze intent. They look for the specific patterns that I now recognize as the preliminaries to a hunt, the slow, circular gathering of trees, the deliberate creation of a new, inviting path where none existed before, the weaving of a willow cage. When my system detects the formation of what Vance called a hunting ground, I no longer feel the cold spike of panic. I feel a grim, cold resolve. I open the protocol toolbox, and I act. 2 months ago, my script detected a significant AAM event in a remote eastern sector, near a popular campground. The footage showed a stand of old-growth fir trees slowly, over the course of a week, leaning away from each other to create a perfect, sheltered clearing, invisible from the main trail. It was an idyllic-looking spot, the kind of place a tired hiker would see as a perfect, hidden campsite. It was a lure. My response was to access the park's weather monitoring system. I fabricated the data for a sudden, highly localized microburst, a violent downdraft of wind targeted at that specific sector. Then I filed an official report, citing the freak weather event and the danger of significant windfall. The trail and the campground were closed for 2 weeks for windfall cleanup and safety assessments. By the time the rangers got there, of course, there were no fallen trees. They logged it as a sensor malfunction, but the hunt was thwarted. The trap was empty. Last month, I watched the willows in the southern marsh begin their horrifying ballet once more. They started to weave their cage, right next to a stream popular with fishermen. This time, my intervention was more biological. I accessed the park's historical archives and found the schematics for an old, long-decommissioned ranger cabin that once stood a mile upstream. I then filed a high-priority environmental report, claiming that a routine satellite imagery analysis suggested the cabin's old septic tank had likely ruptured, contaminating the stream with high levels of E. coli bacteria. Warning signs were posted. The area was cordoned off. The fishermen went elsewhere. The willows, their trap unsprung, eventually unwove their cage. I create lies to protect people from a truth they could never comprehend. A sudden rock slide. A report of a rabid and unusually aggressive coyote that clears a meadow. A warning of unstable, boggy ground that keeps people away from the sycamore grove. I have a dozen plausible disasters at my fingertips. I have become a part of the forest's ecosystem, an unseen force of nature in my own right. I am the predator that hunts the predator. I have never told a soul. Who would believe me? The burden of this knowledge is mine, and mine alone. Sometimes, late at night, when the servers are humming their endless song and the screens are glowing in the dark, I feel a strange kinship with Arthur Vance. I understand his obsession now. I understand his descent from a logical scientist to a terrified believer. I even understand why he felt the need to go out there, to see it for himself. There's a part of me, a deep, primal part, that longs to stand on the serpent's spine and feel the charge in the air, to see with my own eyes if the ground trembles when they move. But I will not make his mistake. My place is here, in this chair, tethered to this world by fiber optic cables and the glow of these screens. I am the only thing standing between the visitors of Pendleton Glades and the ancient, hungry intelligence that slumbers beneath its roots. The cameras are my eyes. The data is my weapon. And the protocol is my shield. The world is so much older and stranger than we allow ourselves to believe. We build our parks, we mark our trails with neat little signs, and we trick ourselves into thinking we have tamed the wilderness. But we are just visitors. Temporary, noisy guests in a house with rules we will never, ever understand. So when you are out there, in the deep places of the world, and you feel that sense of profound, ancient peace in the quiet of the woods, by all means, enjoy it. But remember what that silence truly is. The stillness is not sleep. The forest is not empty. It is watching. It is thinking. It is waiting. And sometimes it moves. Thank you for listening, and for joining me again here at the Wilderness Protocol. The lines between the natural world and the world of the unexplained are often blurred, and the deepest secrets are kept by the oldest witnesses. If you have your own stories from the remote corners of the world, experiences that defy easy explanation, I invite you to share them respectfully in the comments below. These stories deserve to be heard. If you wish to support the channel and hear more dispatches from the edge of the known world, please consider liking this video and subscribing. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next report. Stay safe out there, and stay vigilant. The Blackwood Silence. Why every animal vanishes during a meteor shower. Welcome back to the Wilderness Protocol. There are places in this world, vast stretches of ancient forest and jagged peaks, that operate on a set of rules far older than humanity. We call them national parks. We draw lines on a map and believe we understand them. We set up ranger stations, build trails, and tell ourselves we are the stewards of these lands. But sometimes, the wilderness reminds us that we are merely guests, and that some protocols were not written by man. They were written by the stars. Tonight, we venture into the deep, unsettling heart of Blackwood National Park, a place of breathtaking beauty by day, and by night a place of profound and terrifying mystery. We're not here to talk about common predators or hiker disappearances. We're here to discuss a phenomenon so bizarre, so consistent, it defies all rational explanation. A story whispered among veteran rangers and dismissed by officials. The story of the Blackwood Silence. The story of what happens every time a meteor shower occurs. This isn't a campfire tale. This is a compilation of documented events, eyewitness accounts, and the chilling final report of a man who spent his life protecting a place he eventually learned to fear. This is the story of the day the forest holds its breath. Our story begins, as many do in these remote territories, with a man. His name was Elias Thorne. Elias was not a young, bright-eyed ranger fresh out of training, eager to conquer the wilderness. He was the opposite. By the time our narrative truly takes shape, he was in his late 50s, a man weathered by the very landscape he served. His face was a roadmap of sun-creased lines and quiet concentration, his hands thick and calloused from a lifetime of practical work. For 30 years, Blackwood National Park had been his church, his office, and his home. He didn't just know the park. He was a part of its very rhythm. He knew its symphony. He could tell the time of day by the angle of the sun through the dense canopy of Douglas firs. He knew the chattering alarm call of a squirrel meant a predator was near, just as he knew the lazy drone of bees in the alpine meadows meant a calm, clear afternoon. The distant, powerful bugle of a bull elk at dusk was a sound that settled his soul. And the nightly chorus of the owls, a complex tapestry of hoots and calls echoing through the valleys, was as comforting to him as a lullaby. The park was a living, breathing orchestra of sound and life, and for 3 decades, Elias Thorne had been its most devoted audience. He believed he knew every note, every crescendo, every quiet interlude. He was wrong. The first time he noticed it, he didn't even recognize it for what it was. He dismissed it entirely. It was a crisp, clear night in mid-August, years ago. The annual Perseid meteor shower was putting on a spectacular display. Elias was on a late patrol near Crystal Creek, a remote section of the park rarely visited after dark. He had parked his truck on a bluff overlooking the valley, switched off the engine, and simply sat on the hood for an hour, watching the heavens weep light. It was a moment of profound peace, a silent, brilliant conversation between him and the cosmos. He eventually started the truck and began the long, winding drive back to the ranger station in the pre-dawn darkness. And that's when a strange feeling began to unspool in his gut. It was quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping forest. This was something else. An absolute, unnerving void of sound. The birds, which should have been starting their raucous celebration of the sunrise, were silent. He strained his ears, listening for the familiar rustle in the undergrowth of a foraging raccoon or a skittish rabbit. Nothing. He drove for 10 miles and not a single deer, those ever-present ghosts of the roadside, darted across his headlights. The world outside his vehicle felt like a photograph. Beautiful, but utterly lifeless. He chalked it up to an odd weather pattern. A sudden, sharp drop in barometric pressure, perhaps. Animals are exquisitely sensitive to such things. They hunker down. They wait. It was unusual, but not impossible. In his meticulous daily log, he made a simple note: unusually low wildlife activity, morning of August 13th, possible weather-related. And then he forgot about it. Life, in the park's symphony, returned to normal. A year passed. The seasons turned, painting the park in their familiar palettes of green, gold, and white. Then came the Geminids in December. A much colder night, the air sharp and so clear it felt brittle. Elias was once again on patrol, this time checking the snow line on the northern ridge. He paused to watch the celestial fireworks, each meteor a fiery streak against a backdrop of snow-dusted peaks. The next morning, it happened again. Silence. This time, he felt it instantly. It was a pressure in his ears, a tangible emptiness that seemed to suck the very sound from the air. He stood at the edge of Shadowfen Marshes, a place normally teeming with the cacophony of waterfowl, muskrats, and frogs, and heard nothing. Not a quack. Not a croak. Not the distant slap of a beaver's tail on the water. The air was dead. Motionless. He felt the cold prickle crawl up the back of his neck, a primal instinct screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. This was not a weather pattern. This was not a coincidence. This was an event. He drove back to the station with a growing sense of urgency. He bypassed the coffee pot and went straight to the metal filing cabinet where decades of his own logs were stored. He pulled out the ledger from the previous year, his callous fingers flipping through the pages until he found the date. August 13th. The Perseids. He placed it next to his current log. December 14th. The Geminids. A cold knot formed in the pit of his stomach. The two dates, separated by more than a year, were linked by two things: a major meteor shower and a subsequent day of profound, unnatural silence. From that day forward, Elias Thorne became an astronomer. He bought calendars. He cross-referenced dates. He learned the names of the showers that most people never notice: the Quadrantids in January, the Lyrids in April, the Eta Aquariids in May. For each one, major or minor, he would prepare. He would make sure he was on patrol, deep within the park's borders, observing, listening. The pattern was undeniable. It was terrifyingly precise. It was a protocol. Here's what he discovered, pieced together over several years of clandestine observation. The phenomenon would begin within an hour of the meteor shower's officially predicted peak activity. Whether the sky was clear or cloudy, it made no difference. The trigger was not the visual spectacle, but the event itself. And it would last for exactly 24 hours. Not about a day. Not until the next sunrise. From the moment the silence fell, Elias could set his watch by it. 24 hours. To the minute. For that single day, it was as if every mammal, every bird, every reptile, and every amphibian in the 800,000 acres of Blackwood National Park simply ceased to exist. During these 24-hour periods, Elias would drive the long, winding roads and see nothing. No bears lumbering through the woods. No foxes trotting across the fields. No eagles soaring on the thermals. The trail cameras he meticulously maintained, which normally captured hundreds of images of deer, raccoons, bobcats, and mountain lions, would show nothing but empty frames. A solid, 24-hour block of a world without animals. He searched for evidence of an exodus. He spent hours on the park's boundaries, looking for tracks. If every animal was leaving, there would have to be a trail, a path of unimaginable size. But there was nothing. No massive footprints in the mud. No broken fences. It was not an evacuation. It was a disappearance. Curiously, one form of life seemed entirely unaffected. Insects. The low, insistent hum of flies and mosquitoes, the chirping of crickets, these sounds remained. On a warm day, this created a grotesque and deeply unsettling soundtrack. The tiny, mindless hums of the insect world became the only noise in a forest that should have been roaring with life. It made the silence even more profound. Then, just as suddenly and precisely as it began, it would end. On the 25th hour, the world would switch back on. Elias would be sitting in his truck, watching his clock, and precisely on the hour, he would hear it, a single, tentative birdsong. Then another. A squirrel would chatter indignantly from a branch above him, as if scolding the world for its interruption. A doe and her fawn would step cautiously from the tree line, blinking in the light. The symphony would resume. The animals showed no signs of distress or injury. They weren't emaciated or exhausted from a long journey. They were just back. Where did they go? The question began to consume Elias. It gnawed at the edges of his rational mind. He tried to speak of it once, just once, to a younger, more ambitious supervisor who was visiting from the regional office. He laid out his observations cautiously, framing it as a peculiar behavioral pattern he'd noticed. The supervisor had listened with a patient smile before clapping Elias on the shoulder and laughing. "Come on, Elias. They're just hiding. Probably the lights in the sky spooked them into their burrows for a day. It's a big park. You've been out here alone too long, old-timer." Starting to see patterns in the static, Elias saw the dismissal in his eyes. The pity. He never mentioned it to a superior again. He knew what he was seeing wasn't hiding. Hiding implies presence. Hiding leaves a trace. This was absence. A complete and total void. It felt less like the animals were scared, and more like they were obedient. As if they were answering a silent, cosmic command that he, a mere human, could not hear. He began to keep a private journal, a secret log bound in worn leather, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his small ranger cabin. In it, he documented not just the facts, but his growing fear. The park he loved, his sanctuary, had a dark secret. It was a place with rules he didn't understand. An entry from his private journal, dated from that time, reads, "The forest feels wrong today. It's a beautiful stage, perfectly lit, but all the actors have been sent away. There is an intelligence to this, a purpose. They're not running from something. They're being taken by something, and they go willingly. It feels less like fear and more like reverence." Elias Thorne, the man who knew the park's symphony by heart, had discovered its most terrifying secret, the periodic, scheduled, and absolute silence. The wilderness protocol was in effect, and he was an outsider, looking in at a mystery far older and vaster than he could ever comprehend. The passing of years did little to soften the sharp edges of Elias Thorne's discovery. In fact, time only served to hone the pattern into a terrifying, undeniable truth. The Blackwood silence was not a fluke. It was a fixture, as reliable as the turning of the seasons. Elias evolved from a mere observer into the phenomenon's secret chronicler. His private journal, bound in dark leather, became a scientific document of the highest, strangest order. It was a logbook of the impossible. In its pages, he moved beyond simple observation and began a quiet, desperate investigation. His entries from this period are chilling in their methodical nature, a stark contrast to the sheer irrationality of the events they describe. An entry from October 21st reads, "Orion at its peak tonight. Sky is clear. Temperature is 45 degrees Fahrenheit, wind out of the northwest at 5 miles per hour. I've set up 3 additional motion-activated trail cams along the North Ridge, focusing on the game trails leading towards the park boundary. High bear and elk traffic area. My hypothesis, if the animals are migrating out, even at an impossible speed, there must be tracks. I need to know if they leave prints when they vanish. I need to see the moment of transition." The next day's entry would be stark, written in a tight, controlled script that betrayed his frustration. October 22nd. Silence commenced at approximately 1:30 a.m., an hour after peak shower activity. As expected, drove the entire 60-mile perimeter loop. Not a single vertebrate spotted. Not one. The woods feel wrong. Like a stage set after the actors have gone home. Retrieve the memory cards from the Northridge cams. The final image on each is of an animala bear on camera 1, a herd of deer on 2, a lone wolf on 3. The very next frame, taken seconds later, is empty, and the ground in front of the camera is undisturbed. No tracks leading away. It is not an exodus. It is an erasure. Consumed by this puzzle, Elias turned his attention from the present to the past. He began to reason that a phenomenon this profound, this ancient feeling, could not have begun with him. Others must have noticed. He spent his off days in a place few ever entered, the dusty, subterranean archives of the main park administration building. It was a tomb of forgotten paperwork, of ledgers and reports from rangers long dead and gone. The air was thick with the smell of decaying paper and time itself. He blew the dust off old, leather-bound logbooks, their pages brittle and yellowed. He read the daily accounts of men who patrolled these same woods on horseback, men who wrote in elegant, looping cursive about snowfall, poachers, and forest fires. And there, buried in a log from 1958, he found it. It was a faded entry from a senior ranger named William Miller, a man known for his pragmatic, no-nonsense attitude. The entry was dated August 12th. "A queer thing today," Miller had written. "The Perseid light show was something to behold last night. A real spectacle. Woke this morning to the quietest day I have ever known in these woods. Not a chirp or a growl to be heard from sunup to sundown. Felt the hair on my neck stand up more than once. The local tribesmen, the Klahani, were all holed up in their village on the reservation border. Wouldn't come out for trade. Old Chief says the sky spirits were hunting, and it was the time of the great stillness. He said the forest gives its children to the sky, so the sky won't take ours. Superstitious nonsense, of course, but unsettling all the same. Probably some new disease will sweep through the animal populations. Must keep an eye out for carcasses in the coming weeks." Elias's blood ran cold as he read those words. 1958, a ranger 50 years before him had seen the same thing. And the name the Klahani. He knew of them. A small, indigenous tribe whose ancestral lands had been absorbed when the park boundaries were expanded in the 1970s. Most had been relocated, but a small, insular community still lived on reservation lands that bordered the park's remote western edge. The forest gives its children to the sky. The phrase echoed in Elias's mind. It wasn't the rambling of a superstitious man. It was an explanation. A terrible, mythic explanation for an event he had been trying and failing to frame with science. He knew he had to talk to them, but he also knew he couldn't approach them with nothing but a half-century-old journal entry and his own wild stories. He needed more. He needed data. He needed proof that could not be dismissed as a lonely old man's fantasy. And that's when he made a call he hadn't made in a very long time. A call to his nephew, Dr. Eris Thorne. Eris was everything Elias was not. Young, ambitious, a PhD in bioacoustics and environmental science from a prestigious university. He lived in a world of data streams, sonograms, peer-reviewed papers, and academic grants. He saw the world through a lens of empirical, verifiable evidence. The relationship between the two men was cordial but strained. Eris viewed his uncle as a relic, a Luddite who had chosen a life of rustic solitude over family and intellectual ambition. Elias saw his nephew as a brilliant boy who couldn't see the soul of the forest for the data points. When Elias called and, with uncharacteristic vulnerability, laid out his theory, Eris's reaction was exactly what Elias had expected. "Uncle Elias," Eris had said, his voice a carefully modulated blend of pity and professional exasperation. "Are you listening to yourself? You're talking about the instantaneous disappearance and reappearance of millions of animals across an 800,000-acre geographical area. An event triggered by space dust burning up in our atmosphere? That's not science. That's the synopsis for a bad sci-fi movie." "I'm not asking you to believe me, Eris," Elias replied, his own voice steady, refusing to waver. "I'm asking you to help me prove I'm wrong. Bring your gear. Bring your fancy machines. Your sound sensors, your thermal cameras, your seismic detectors. Bring it all. The Leonids are in 3 weeks. It's one of the big ones. A meteor storm, they're predicting. Come to Blackwood. See for yourself." There was a quality in his uncle's voice that gave Eris pause. It wasn't the rambling of a man losing his grip. It was a profound, chilling certainty that cut through the static of the phone line. Against his better judgment, intrigued by the sheer, arrogant impossibility of the claim, Eris agreed. He would come, if only to debunk this wild theory with hard data and, perhaps, gently convince his uncle it was finally time to retire. He arrived a week before the meteor shower, his white university van packed to the roof with state-of-the-art equipment. He treated the excursion like a field trip, a chance to gather some baseline environmental data in a pristine, dark sky park. Elias, however, was all business. He took Eris to a specific location he had been scouting for years, a high, isolated meadow known as Sentinel's Watch. It was a perfect natural laboratory, a large, open basin surrounded on 3 sides by steep, impassable rock cliffs. There was only one main game trail leading in and out a natural bottleneck. "If they're leaving, they have to pass this way," Elias explained, pointing to the well-worn trail. "We'll set up cameras here. Thermal, night vision, high-speed the works. We'll catch them in the act of leaving." Eris shook his head, a wry smile on his face. "You're still thinking about it like a physical evacuation, Uncle. But your own notes say there are no tracks. That's the key. If they're disappearing, it's not a physical process as we know it. I'm more interested in the how than the where. I want to set up a full-spectrum audio array. If there's a trigger, a signal on a frequency we can't hear infrasound, ultrasound-me equipment will pick it up. I'll also deploy a network of seismic sensors. If there's a subterranean component, some kind of resonant vibration, we'll know." For the next few days, they worked together, a strange and unlikely pair. The old ranger and the young scientist. Old woodcraft and new technology. Elias showed Eris how to move silently through the forest, how to read the wind and predict animal movement. Eris showed Elias how to calibrate a parabolic microphone and interpret a thermal signature on a laptop screen. A fragile, unspoken truce formed between them, born of a shared, singular purpose. On the final day of their preparations, Elias took a detour. He drove them out to the western edge of the park, to the sun-beaten collection of small homes that made up the Klahani Reservation. He found an elder named Jacob sitting on the porch of a weathered, single-story house, carving a piece of wood. The man's face was a mask of deep wrinkles, but his eyes were sharp and missed nothing. Elias approached respectfully, with Eris hanging back, looking awkward and out of place. Elias didn't ask about superstitions. He asked about history. He asked about the time of the Great Stillness. Jacob looked at Elias for a long moment, then his gaze drifted to Eris and his clean, city clothes. Finally, he looked up at the vast blue sky, as if gauging the time. He spoke slowly, his voice as raspy as dry leaves. "You are the ranger," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "You have seen it. The time the forest pays its tithe. My grandfather told me, and his grandfather told him. When the sky people ride their fiery canoes across the night, they come to collect. It is a covenant, ancient and unbreakable. They take the beast for a day and a night, so they do not take us. It is the price of peace." He gestured vaguely towards the forest. "You cannot see them, but the animals can. They do not run in fear. They go willingly. They answer the call. It is the law of this place, older than the mountains." He then fixed his sharp eyes on Eris. "Your machines will not see. Your microphones will not hear. They listen for the world you know. This event it is of the other world. The world that hangs beside ours, thin as smoke in the winter air." He turned back to Elias, and his voice dropped, taking on a tone of stark warning. "You should not be in the woods when they come. It is not for your eyes. To witness the collection is to invite their attention. The animals know to be silent, and to disappear. You should learn the same. As they drove away in Elias's truck, the silence was thick between them. Finally, Eris broke it, his voice dripping with condescension. Fascinating folklore, uncle. A tie to the sky people. It's a classic cultural response to an observable but inexplicable natural event. They build a myth to explain the unexplainable. Elias said nothing. He just gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He had sought out science to debunk a myth, but the myth had offered a more terrifyingly coherent explanation than the science ever could. The Leonid meteor storm was now less than 48 hours away, and deep in the heart of Blackwood, at Sentinel's watch, a vast array of electronic eyes and ears lay in wait, ready to record a miracle or a nightmare. The night of the Leonid meteor storm arrived with an almost theatrical sense of occasion. There was a palpable weight in the air, a stillness that went beyond a simple lack of wind. The sky, scrubbed clean of clouds, was a vast, bottomless expanse of black velvet, pricked with the cold, indifferent light of a billion stars. It was a perfect night for watching the heavens. It was a perfect night for an ancient ritual. Elias and Eris were concealed in a small, cramped blind they had constructed on the rocky ridge overlooking Sentinel's watch. The position gave them a commanding, godlike view of the entire meadow below. Bathed in the pale, ethereal light of a half-moon, the meadow was their stage. Before them, the glow of Eris's laptop cast a pale, blue light on their tense faces. The screen was a mosaic of data. A dozen different feeds tracked the life of the meadow. There were thermal camera views, showing the bright, warm signatures of life moving in the cool darkness. There were high-definition night vision feeds, painting the world in eerie shades of green and gray. And in the corner of the screen, a real-time sonogram translated the sounds of the forest into a living, dancing line of peaks and troughs. The low, constant hum of their portable generator, muffled and hidden 100 yards away, was the only man-made sound for miles. For the first few hours, everything was precisely as it should be. The symphony of the night played its familiar, comforting tune. Eris, pointing at his screen, narrated the events with a detached, scientific calm. Okay, Thermal Cam 2 shows a herd of 6 elk moving into the eastern side of the meadow. You can see the large bull, the brighter signature there. Night vision on the game trail just picked up a family of raccoons, 4 of them. And the audio array is picking up the standard nocturnals. Great horned owl, coyote pack about 2 clicks south, and the usual insect and amphibian chorus. He leaned back in his chair, a smug look of vindication on his face. See, Uncle Elias? It's all here. Nothing unusual. They're just being animals. I'm gathering some fantastic baseline data, but that's all it's going to be. Elias didn't respond. He didn't look at the laptop. His gaze was fixed upward, at the sky. He was watching, waiting. Around midnight, the show began. The first Leonid streaked across the darkness, a brilliant, impossibly fast slash of green and white fire. It was gone in an instant, leaving a phantom trail on the retina. Then another, and another. Soon, the sky was alive with them, a silent, breathtaking rain of celestial light. Eris was momentarily distracted from his data, looking up in genuine awe. You have to admit, it's beautiful, he said, his voice losing its professional edge. Wait for it, Elias whispered, his voice tight with a tension that was almost painful. It happened at 1:17 a.m., the officially predicted peak of the storm. Eris was looking at his main thermal camera feed, which was focused on the magnificent bull elk standing proudly in the center of the meadow. The animal was a bright, warm beacon of life against the cool, dark background of the grass. One moment, it was there, a living, breathing creature of muscle and heat. The next, it was gone. It didn't run off. The camera's frame rate was 60 frames per second. There was no blur of motion. It didn't fade away like a dying ember. It blinked out of existence. One frame, the elk was there. The next frame, there was only the lingering heat signature on the cold ground where it had stood a ghost of warmth that was already beginning to fade. What the? Eris breathed, his face inches from the screen. He clicked the mouse frantically, toggling to another camera. It was aimed at a small group of 5 deer grazing peacefully near the tree line. They were there, and now they were not. Gone. In the exact same instant. He started jumping between feeds, his hands flying across the keyboard. Every warm-blooded creature in Sentinel's watch, from the largest elk to the smallest field mouse his high-resolution thermal camera could detect, had vanished. In the same single, silent, imperceptible tick of time. And then, the sound cut out. The vibrant, dancing line of the sonogram on his laptop, which had been a lively representation of the forest pulse, flatlined. It became a perfectly straight, dead line. The howl of the distant coyotes, the hoot of the owl, the chirping of the crickets, all of it, gone. The only sound left in their headphones was the sterile electronic hiss of an open channel and the faint, far-off hum of their own generator. The audio array must have failed, Eris stammered, his scientific composure shattering into a million pieces. He began typing furiously, running diagnostics. His voice was a rising tide of panic. No power levels are optimal, all connections are stable, it's not a malfunction. There's no sound to record, nothing above the level of background noise. The silence that fell upon the meadow, and upon their small blind, was nothing like the quiet Elias had experienced on his morning patrols. This was the event itself. It was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered the world. The air pressure seemed to drop, making their ears pop. It was a crushing, suffocating, absolute void. It felt as if the entire universe was holding its breath, and they were trapped in its lungs. Elias slowly raised a pair of high-powered binoculars to his eyes, his hand steady. He scanned the moonlit meadow. It was empty. The game trail was deserted. The forest beyond was a wall of blackness, utterly devoid of life or movement. It was a perfect, pristine diorama. "This is impossible," Eris whispered, his face a pale, ghostly mask in the blue glow of the laptop. He was no longer a scientist. He was a terrified man grappling with the wreckage of his entire worldview. This violates the laws of everything. Conservation of mass. Thermodynamics. Where did the biomass go? And then, a new sound began. It wasn't picked up by Eris's dead microphones. It was a sound they felt more than heard. It seemed to bypass their ears entirely and resonate directly inside their skulls. A low, pulsating hum, just on the very edge of human perception. It was a deeply unpleasant, nauseating frequency that vibrated in their bones and teeth. Elias felt the fine hairs on his arms and the back of his neck stand on end. "Jacob's warning," he muttered, his voice raspy. To witness the collection. Eris, his mind still desperately trying to clutch at the straws of science, mumbled, "It's a subsonic frequency in infrasound. The generator must be interfering with." He trailed off as his eyes darted to another, forgotten corner of his screen. The graph from the seismic sensor network, which had been a flat line, began to twitch. A slow, rhythmic tremor was pulsing through the ground beneath them. It was too regular, too metronomic to be a natural earthquake. Thump, thump, thump like a colossal, impossibly slow heartbeat. "What is that?" Eris asked, his voice trembling uncontrollably now. Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. He was staring, transfixed, at the center of the meadow. The air there, the very fabric of space, had begun to shimmer. It was like the heat haze rising from an asphalt road on a blistering summer day, but this was a freezing night. The distortion grew, twisting the moonlight, bending the image of the trees on the far side of the meadow. It looked like a patch of the world had been carved out and replaced with flawed, warped glass. A strange, acrid smell, a chemical cocktail of ozone and burnt cinnamon, drifted up to their blind, stinging their nostrils. The humming in their heads intensified, climbing in pitch, becoming a sickening, vibratory pressure. Through the shimmering distortion, they saw something. It wasn't a creature, not in any biological sense they could understand. It was movement, shapes, impossible geometries of pure, non-reflective blackness that seemed to swallow the light. They twisted and folded in on themselves in ways that made the human brain ache, defying the laws of perspective. It was like looking at a tear in the fabric of reality and seeing the cold, alien machinery of the universe working behind the curtain. Suddenly, with a crackle of static, Eris's laptop screen went dead. Black. All his cameras, all his sensors, everything went dark at once. "EMP," he yelled, his voice cracking, a shout of half-terror, half-scientific awe. A massive, localized electromagnetic pulse. The hum in their heads climbed to an unbearable, piercing shriek. It was a physical assault. Elias and Eris clapped their hands over their ears, a useless, reflexive gesture. The sound wasn't outside them. It was inside them. And as they cowered, paralyzed with a primal fear that strips away all thoughts of science or reason, they saw one final, horrifying detail through the shimmering rift. For a fleeting, crystal-clear second, the distortion cleared. They saw not the forest on the other side of the meadow, but stars. A different sky. Alien constellations in impossible, vivid colors against a nebula of bruised purple and sickly green. And silhouetted against this cosmic vista were the shapes. The unmistakable forms of the deer, the elk, the bears of their world, suspended in a silent, weightless, horrifying tableau. They were specimens. A collection. Then, as quickly as it had formed, the shimmering vortex collapsed in on itself with a silent, violent implosion of light. The humming stopped. The ground ceased to tremble. The foul smell vanished. And all that was left was the silence. The profound, empty, terrible silence of Blackwood National Park. They remained in the blind until the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the eastern peaks. They were two men, hollowed out and shattered by what they had witnessed. They didn't speak. There were no words in the human language to encompass the sheer, reality-bending horror of the night. Eris Thorne's scientific certainty, the very foundation of his identity, lay in ruins around him. Elias Thorne's quiet dread, a feeling he had lived with for years, had been replaced by a new and far more profound terror, the terror of confirmed knowledge. The myth was real. When the first direct rays of sun finally touched the valley floor, they ventured down from the ridge. Their movements were slow, hesitant, like astronauts stepping onto an alien world. The air was still dead. Their own footsteps on the damp grass sounded like gunshots in the oppressive, unnatural quiet. They first went to check the equipment. Eris's expensive, state-of-the-art scientific array was now just a pile of junk. The massive electromagnetic pulse had done its job with surgical precision. Every circuit board was melted, every delicate sensor fused into a useless lump of plastic and metal. The laptops were bricks. The memory cards were wiped clean, their data irrevocably erased. It was a multi-thousand-dollar pyre of modern technology, sacrificed on the altar of a phenomenon it was never equipped to understand. There was no proof. It was as if the event had consciously and deliberately scrubbed its own footprints from existence. They walked cautiously towards the center of the meadow, to the exact spot where they had seen the shimmering, impossible rift. The ground there was changed. In a perfect, geometrically precise circle, about 30 feet in diameter, the grass, the soil, the very earth itself had been fused into a smooth, black, glassy substance. It was not scorched, like after a fire. It was transmuted. The surface was seamless and obsidian dark, reflecting the morning sky like a black mirror. A scar on the face of the world. Elias knelt, his knees cracking in the silence, and touched it. It was cool, almost cold, to the touch. He took out his trusty ranger's knife, the one he'd used for everything from cutting rope to clearing brush, and tried to scratch the surface. The hardened steel blade skittered off the black glass with a shrill screech, not leaving so much as a faint mark. It was harder than any rock Elias had ever known. There was nothing else. No tracks leading to or from the circle. No residue. No radiation, at least none they could feel. Just this impossible artifact burned into the meadow floor, and the all-encompassing, soul-crushing silence. They spent the rest of that day, the remainder of the 24-hour period, in a state of shared shock. They drove the park roads, a silent pilgrimage through a beautiful, sunlit tomb. They walked the familiar trails, calling out, listening for any response. There was none. Blackwood National Park was a museum of a forest, its exhibits perfectly in place, but with all the life gone. The return came at exactly 1:17 a.m. the following night. 24 hours. To the minute. They were standing at the edge of Sentinel's watch, having managed to power up a single, spare thermal camera with the generator. One moment, there was silence and emptiness. The next the world switched back on. It wasn't a gradual return. It was instantaneous. A cricket chirped, its sound so sudden and sharp it made them both jump. Then an owl hooted from a nearby pine, its call sounding shaky and confused. Then, a cacophony erupted. It was as if every bird, every creature, began to make noise at the exact same instant. But it wasn't the normal, peaceful symphony of the forest. It was a chaotic, panicked scream. It was the sound of a million voices waking up from a nightmare all at once. On the small thermal camera screen, the world repopulated. Bright, warm shapes began to pop back into existence across the meadow. A deer flickered into view, stumbled as if its legs weren't its own, and then bolted in sheer terror into the trees. A bear appeared in a flash of heat, shook its massive head violently from side to side, and ran. They were back, but they were traumatized. In the days and weeks that followed, the park was different. The animals were deeply disturbed. They were skittish, wary, staying deep in the cover of the woods. The symphony had returned, but it was now played in a constant minor key, a tune full of fear and discordance. The balance had been broken. Eris packed up what was left of his ruined gear a few days later. He was a changed man. The arrogant, dismissive scientist was gone, replaced by a haunted, hollow-eyed man who seemed to have aged a decade in a single night. "We can't tell anyone," he said to Elias before he drove away, his voice barely a whisper. "Who would believe us? They'd lock us up. We have no proof. My data is gone. My career would be over. All we have is a patch of weird glass in a meadow and a story that breaks every known law of physics." "It's not a story," Elias said quietly, looking out at the mountains. "It's a protocol." Eris nodded slowly, the understanding dawning in his tired eyes. "The wilderness protocol, I get it now. It's not our protocol. We just live here." He got into his van and drove away, and to Elias's knowledge, Dr. Eris Thorne never spoke of what he saw in Blackwood National Park ever again. Elias Thorne served 2 more years as a park ranger before taking an early retirement. He couldn't bear to be the steward of a place whose true master was so terrifyingly alien. His final official report on the Leonid meteor storm was a masterpiece of understatement and obfuscation. He logged the event as a significant equipment malfunction due to a severe, localized atmospheric electrical event. He noted the unusual and prolonged period of animal inactivity, likely caused by stress from said event. He mentioned the glassy patch of ground in Sentinel's watch, officially recommending it for geological study, knowing full well that no geologist on Earth could ever truly explain it. He lived out the rest of his days in a small, isolated cabin just outside the park's borders. He never went deep into the woods again on a night when the stars were scheduled to fall. He became a watcher from a distance, a silent guardian of the terrible secret. He finally understood the Klahani Elder's warning. He had witnessed the collection. He had invited the attention of the sky people. And now, sometimes, on cold, clear nights, he would look up at the star-dusted sky and feel a chilling certainty that he was being watched in return. Not by the familiar creatures of the forest, but by the cold, silent, hungry stars above. The Blackwood silence is not a myth. It is a recurring, documented event, hidden in plain sight. It is a chilling reminder that our understanding of the universe is infinitesimally small. We draw our maps and make our rules, but the wilderness has its own, and they are far more ancient and far more terrifying than we can possibly imagine. The account of Elias and Eris Thorn is the most detailed we have, but it is not the only one. Faded logs, local legends, and the hushed whispers of those who live on the fringes of these great, wild places all tell a similar story. A story of a great quiet that falls with the shooting stars. What do you think happens in Blackwood National Park? Is it an ancient covenant, a tithe paid to cosmic landlords, as the Klahani believe? Is it an advanced, non-terrestrial species conducting unimaginably complex ecological surveys? Or is it something far stranger, a dimensional rift, a place where our world briefly and terrifyingly overlaps with another? The truth, perhaps, is a secret the forest intends to keep. Thank you for joining us at the Wilderness Protocol. If you have stories of strange and unexplained phenomena from the wild places of the world, we invite you to share them in the comments below. These accounts are important. They are the whispers that remind us we are not alone. And if you wish to explore more of the mysteries that lie just beyond the trail's end, be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next expedition into the unknown. Until next time, stay safe and listen closely to the woods, because the wilderness is always watching.